They call it a gift. The Navigator houses, those ancient bloodlines whose genetic aberration allows humanity to traverse the warp, speak of it as a blessing. A mutation so valuable that we alone are sanctioned, protected, cherished by the Imperium despite being abhuman. We are the exception to the rule that says deviation from baseline human warrants execution. We are too useful to kill, too necessary to purge, too valuable to lose. My name is Lucia Meridian Nostromo, and I am a Navigator of the House Nostromo, one of the 63 Navigator houses that hold monopolies over warp travel in the Imperium of man. I am 17 years old by Terran standard, though I have experienced approximately 43 years of subjective time due to the temporal distortions inherent in warp travel. I am writing this in the brief moments of clarity between voyages when my third eye is bandaged and my mind is my own again. I am writing it because someone needs to understand what we sacrifice, what we endure, what the Imperium takes from us in exchange for keeping humanity connected across the stars. They call it a gift. They are liars. The warp eye, the third eye that opens in our foreheads when we reach adolescence, is not a gift. It is a curse that lets us see what humans were never meant to perceive. It shows us the Immaterium in all its writhing horror. It reveals the warp's true nature, not empty space or scientific phenomenon, but a dimension of thought and emotion made manifest where demons hunt and chaos gods play games with human souls as pieces. And we must look into that abyss, must navigate through it, must keep our sanity while guiding million-ton vessels through a realm that actively wants to devour us. Most of us last 15 years before we break. I've already lasted 8. I can feel the cracks spreading. This is my testimony, my confession, the truth about what it means to be a navigator in the grim darkness of the far future. The Emperor protects, they tell us. But he cannot protect us from what we see in the warp. Nothing can. I was 9 years old when my third eye opened. Not the age and years I'd lived. By then, I'd already experienced perhaps 14 years of subjective time due to exposure to temporal anomalies during my mother's warp voyages while I was in utero. But 9 years by the calendar the house used to track biological development. The Nostromo house maintains detailed genetic records dating back 8,000 years, tracking the bloodline's purity with obsessive precision. We know exactly when the warp eye will manifest in each child. Between the ages of 8 and 12, triggered by hormonal changes associated with puberty catalyzed by rituals known only to the Navigator houses. They prepared me for it my entire childhood. They were liars. The opening ceremony took place in the precognition chamber at the heart of House Nostromo's fortress estate on Terra. The room was ancient, pre-Imperial, some claimed, dating back to the dark age of technology when humanity first discovered warp travel. The walls were lined with inscriptions in languages dead so long that even the Administratum's oldest archives couldn't translate them. My mother attended, of course. Navigator matriarch Cassandra Nostromo, one of the house's most accomplished pilots whose career spanned 3 centuries and included navigation through the cicatrix maledictum itself during the Noctis Aeterna. She wore her ceremonial robes black and silver marked with the house sigil, and her headband concealed the third eye that had defined her life. "You are ready," she told me, though it wasn't a question. Readiness was irrelevant. The opening would happen whether I was prepared or not. Around me stood the house's elders, 12 ancient navigators whose own warp eyes had seen so much that some had gone blind in their conventional eyes, their minds focusing entirely on the third eye's visions. They chanted in high Gothic, words I'd memorized but didn't fully understand. Invocations to the Emperor, prayers for protection. Bargains with forces they wouldn't name explicitly. "Lucia Meridian Nostromo," the eldest spoke, his voice like grinding stone. You are blood of our blood, gene heir to the ancient compact, born to guide humanity through the darkness between stars. Do you accept your burden? I was 9 years old. What choice did I have? I accept, I said, because those were the words expected. The ritual began. They gave me the catalyst first, a substance I later learned was distilled from psychically active materials, designed to lower the barriers between real space and the Immaterium. It tasted like copper and regret, thick enough to coat my throat as I swallowed. The effect was immediate. My normal vision began to blur, the physical world losing definition as something else intruded. I could see layers. Reality had layers I'd never perceived before. The walls of the precognition chamber weren't solid. They were suggestions, consensus reality maintained through collective human belief, but ultimately just one interpretation of matter. The warp is truth, Mother whispered. What you see now is what lies beneath the lies. The universe as it actually is, emotion given form, thought made manifest. This is the Navigator's sight. The elders began the next phase of the ritual. They produced an artifact, a crystallized fragment of something they called warp essence, though I'd later learn it was actually a bound minor demon, imprisoned in crystal since the age of strife. They pressed it against my forehead, directly above and between my normal eyes. The pain was transcendent. Not physical pain, though my skull felt like it was splitting, but psychic agony. The sensation of my consciousness being forcibly opened, expanded, made to perceive dimensions it wasn't designed for. I screamed, but the sound came out wrong, echoing in frequencies that didn't exist in real space. And then my third eye opened. The first thing I saw was the truth about my mother. She stood before me, but the woman I knew, stern, controlled, the perfect exemplar of House Nostromo's discipline, was just a shell. Beneath that facade, visible only to my new sight, I saw what the warp had done to her. Her soul was tattered, pieces of it missing, carved away by 3 centuries of warp exposure. Where there should have been unified consciousness, there were gaps, holes where demons had nibbled at her essence, where warp storms had scoured away parts of her identity, where the simple act of navigating through hell dimensions had cost her fragments of herself. She was still alive, still functional, still one of the house's finest navigators. But the person she'd been before the opening was long dead, replaced by a collection of remaining pieces held together through discipline and augmetics and sheer stubborn refusal to disintegrate. You see it now, she said quietly, and I realized she knew exactly what I was perceiving. This is what we are, what we become, the price for our gift. I looked at the elders with my new sight, and the horror compounded. They were worse. Centuries of warp exposure had left them less human than my mother. Some had souls so fragmented they barely qualified as individual consciousnesses anymore. Others had developed growths, psychic tumors where their essence had been infected by warp energies and metastasized into something other. One elder's soul was literally growing teeth. "The Emperor preserves us," the eldest said, though his words sounded hollow to my new perception. I could see the lie. He didn't believe it. None of them did. They mouthed the words because the alternative was admitting they'd been slowly consumed by the thing they navigated for 300 years. "I want to close it," I whispered, my hand reaching for the eye that had opened in my forehead. "Please. I don't want to see this." "You cannot close it," Mother said, and her voice carried the weight of 3 centuries of experience. "The warp eye opens once and never closes. You will see this reality for the rest of your life. In time, you will learn to control it, to focus it, to use it to navigate, but you will never stop seeing." "How do you bear it?" I asked, looking at her tattered soul, at the pieces missing, at the slow dissolution that defined every navigator's existence. She was silent for a long moment. "We don't," she finally admitted. We just persist. For as long as we can, until we can't anymore. The first week after the opening was absolute hell. My third eye couldn't be bandaged yet. It needed time to stabilize, to integrate with my consciousness, which meant I saw everything in dual reality. The physical world overlaid with the warp's truth. I saw servants walking the house's corridors, but I also saw their souls. Small, flickering things compared to navigators' enhanced essences, but present nonetheless. Some were bright, burning with faith or hope or simple determination. Others were dim, guttering candles, barely maintaining consciousness. And a few were already dead, their bodies moving through habit while their souls had departed to wherever souls went when they left Imperial service. I saw the fortress estate itself and realized it wasn't just stone and metal. The entire structure had been warded with psychic protections. Runes and symbols and architectural geometries designed to create a space where warp influence was minimized. The walls were inscribed with prayers in that dead language, and those prayers had power. They pushed back against the Immaterium, creating a bubble of stable reality. But even here, in the heart of a navigator house on Terra itself, I could see the warp pressing against the barriers. Constantly. Eternally. Trying to seep in through any gap, any weakness, any moment of reduced vigilance. The universe, I realized, was not naturally lawful. Physics, causality, linear time, these were local phenomena maintained only through constant effort. The warp was the default state. Chaos was fundamental. Order was the aberration that required endless energy to sustain. "You're beginning to understand," my tutor said during my first lesson after the opening. His name was Navigator Savant Marcus, and he'd been teaching Navigator children for 80 years. His own third eye was covered by a bandana marked with protective runes, but even bandaged. I could sense it watching me with sight that saw through dimensions. "Understand what?" I asked, though I already knew. "Why we matter. Why the Imperium tolerates us despite our mutation. Why we're too valuable to purge." He gestured to a hololithic display showing the galaxy. "Without navigators, there is no Imperium. Ships traveling through the warp without our guidance have a 98% casualty rate. They emerge years off course, centuries late, sometimes before they departed, or they never emerge at all. The warp consumes them." "But we can see through it," I said slowly. "The third eye sees the warp's currents, its storms, its dangers. We can chart courses that avoid the worst of it." "Exactly. We are humanity's only reliable method of faster-than-light travel. Every merchant vessel, every warship, every colonization fleet, they all depend on us. Our mutation is so valuable that the Imperium overlooks what we are." "What are we?" I asked. Marcus pulled his bandana aside, revealing his third eye. It was clouded, the iris swirling with colors that shouldn't exist, the pupil vertical like a cat's. When he opened it fully, I felt the warp's presence intensify, reality thinning around him as he accessed sight beyond sight. "We're weapons," he said quietly. "Living tools the Imperium uses to maintain its empire. We're pampered, protected, given privileges that regular humans can only dream of. But we're not free. We belong to our houses, and our houses belong to the Imperium, and the Imperium will use us until we break." "How long until we break?" I asked. "Depends on the navigator. Average career is 15 years of active service. Some last 5. A rare few make it to 30. After that," he gestured vaguely, "retirement if you're lucky. House Nostromo takes care of its retired navigators, gives them comfortable quarters. access to care. Lets them live out whatever time remains with some dignity. And if you're not lucky, then you break during a voyage, Marcus said bluntly. Your mind shatters while you're guiding a ship through the warp. The vessel is lost, along with its crew, cargo, and passengers. Thousands of souls gone because one navigator couldn't hold it together. He closed his third eye and replaced the bandana. That's the real burden, Lucia. Not the seeing, not the horror of perceiving the warp's truth, but the knowledge that if you fail, when you eventually fail, you'll take thousands of innocent people with you. I had my first nightmare about the warp that night. I was in a ship, not one I recognized, but the sensation was unmistakable. The navigator's throne, the Geller field generators humming around me. The sensation of being between spaces, and I was navigating, my third eye open, watching the warp's currents. But something was wrong. The currents were changing faster than I could adapt. What had been a stable passage was becoming turbulent, warp storms forming from nothing, and I couldn't find the path, couldn't see the way through, and the ship was being pulled off course, dragged towards something vast and hungry that was watching me with attention that felt like being dissected. I woke up screaming. Mother was there immediately, her hand on my forehead, her own third eye open and blazing with power as she did something. Psychic pressure that pushed back against whatever had infected my dreams. First warp dream, she said once I'd stopped screaming. They'll continue. Every navigator has them. The warp doesn't let go easily once it's touched you. How do you sleep? I gasped. Poorly, she admitted. And less with each passing year. Eventually, most navigators simply stop sleeping properly. We meditate instead, or use chemical assistance, or learn to function on micro-rests that don't allow deep enough sleep for the warp dreams to manifest. She sat on the edge of my bed, and for a moment she looked almost human again. Almost like a mother instead of a 300-year-old weapon wearing human skin. I'm sorry, she said quietly. I'm sorry that this is your inheritance, that you were born into a bloodline that sees what it shouldn't see, that the only choice you had was between this or being culled from the gene line before puberty. They would have killed me? I asked, though I wasn't surprised. Not killed, sterilized, prevented from reproducing, assigned to house service in a non-navigator capacity. You'd have been comfortable, cared for, but ultimately erased from the bloodline's future. She looked at me with eyes that held 3 centuries of exhaustion. This is better, or at least I've spent 300 years telling myself it's better. Is it? I asked. She didn't answer, because we both knew the truth. The warp eye wasn't a gift. It was a genetic aberration that the Imperium had weaponized, turned into the foundation of its faster-than-light travel infrastructure, and built an entire social class around maintaining. We weren't blessed, we were exploited, and the exploitation would continue until we broke, and then the house would find another child with the right genes and repeat the cycle, forever. Or until the Imperium finally fell and the warp consumed everything. Whichever came first. They sent me on my first voyage 3 years after the opening. 12 years old by house chronology, though subjectively I'd experienced perhaps 19 years of consciousness, due to the temporal distortions my developing third eye created even when bandaged. Time stopped being linear once you could perceive the warp. Past, present, and future became suggestions rather than absolutes. The vessel was the Merchant's Grace, a dictator-class cruiser retrofitted for cargo transport carrying agricultural tithes from the agri-world of Thessia Prime to the forge world of Gryphon Zumofor. A standard route, well-charted, considered safe by Navigator House standards, which meant only a 15% casualty rate for novice navigators. 15%. 1 in 7 ships never arrived, and they were sending 12-year-olds because that was when we were considered ready. You will have a master navigator accompanying you, the house's voyage coordinator informed me during the pre-departure briefing. His name was Castellan Vor, a man so augmented with life extension technology that his original biology was barely 20% of his mass. Navigator Primus Hadrian will observe your navigation and intervene only if catastrophic failure seems imminent. How will he know if catastrophic failure is imminent? I asked. He's been navigating for 42 years, Vor replied. He'll know. 42 years. More than double the average career length. That meant Hadrian was either exceptionally skilled or exceptionally lucky. Probably both. Probably also completely insane by normal human standards. The voyage should take approximately 6 weeks real space time, accounting for warp translation variance. Vor continued, you will navigate in 4-hour shifts alternating with Hadrian. This allows your mind to rest between warp exposures. Do not exceed 4 hours under any circumstances. Prolonged exposure during novice voyages has a 73% correlation with early psychological breakdown. What happens if I break? I asked bluntly. Vor's augmetic eyes clicked as they refocused. Then Navigator Hadrian assumes full control and you are sedated for the remainder of the voyage. Upon return, you are evaluated for continued service or retirement. Retirement was a polite word for being locked in a secured facility where broken navigators lived out their remaining years under heavy medication. Their minds too fractured to function, but their genes too valuable to simply terminate. I won't break, I said with more confidence than I felt. No navigator believes they will break, Vor replied. Until they do. Dismissed. I met Navigator Primus Hadrian in the Merchant's Grace's Navigator Chamber 3 hours before departure. The chamber was located at the ship's prow, isolated from the rest of the vessel by multiple bulkheads and psychic wards. The walls were inscribed with protective runes, similar to those in House Nostromo's fortress, but more focused, designed specifically to shield the navigator's mind from the worst of the warp's influence during voyages. Hadrian was older than I'd expected. Not chronologically, he was probably only 60 standard years. But in the way that mattered, his soul, visible to my third eye even through its bandages, was so tattered it barely held together. 42 years of warp exposure had carved away at least 60% of his original essence. What remained was held together by willpower and augmetics and something else. Something crystalline and hard that I'd later learn to recognize in all veteran navigators. The part of consciousness that refused to dissolve even when every rational reason said it should. Lucia Nostromo, he greeted me, his voice rough from decades of breathing recycled ship air. His own bandana covered his third eye, but I could sense it even concealed. A presence that pressed against reality, constantly accessing sight beyond sight. Your first voyage. Excited? Terrified, I admitted. Good. Terror keeps you careful. Confidence gets novices killed. He gestured to the navigator's throne, an elaborate piece of equipment that was part life support system, part psychic amplifier, part restraint. That will be your position during navigation. It monitors your vital signs, provides chemical stabilization if your body begins shutting down from warp exposure, and restrains you if you try to claw your eyes out during transit. Does that happen often? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted the answer. Often enough that the restraints are standard. He settled into his own throne beside mine. The voyage is 6 weeks. You'll take first shift once we translate to the warp. 4 hours navigation, then I take over while you rest. We alternate until we reach Griffonvar 4 or die trying. Simple. What do I do if something goes wrong? Depends on what goes wrong. Hadrian pulled his bandana aside slightly, revealing a sliver of his third eye, The iris was fragmented like broken glass and the pupil wasn't quite centered. Warp storms? Navigate around them. Follow the calmer currents. Demon manifestation? The Geller field should handle it, but inform me immediately if you see one approaching the ship. Time dilation? Note it in the log, but continue navigation. We can't control temporal variance, only ride it out. And if something goes wrong that you haven't mentioned, then we're probably already dead and worrying about it is pointless. He smiled, and the expression looked wrong on a face that had seen too much. Welcome to Navigator service, child. Now strap in. We translate in 2 hours. The translation from real space to warp space is difficult to describe to someone who hasn't experienced it. The ship doesn't move exactly. Reality moves around the ship. The physical laws that govern normal space simply stop applying. And for the few seconds during translation before the Geller field fully activates, everyone aboard the vessel experiences a moment of absolute existential terror as their consciousness briefly touches the Immaterium. Most crew members are heavily sedated during translation. Those who aren't often develop psychological problems. Navigators experience it fully conscious, third eye open, perceiving the transition in its complete horror. I felt the Merchant's Grace shudder as the warp engines activated. The physical sensation was minimal, a vibration through the deck plating, a subtle pressure change, but psychically it was apocalyptic. Reality tore. That's the only way to describe it. The universe simply ripped open, creating a wound through which we fell, and on the other side was something that shouldn't exist. The warp, the Immaterium, the Sea of Souls. Hell, by any reasonable definition. I'd seen the warp before, of course. Every navigator saw glimpses of it during training, looking through carefully controlled apertures while safely grounded on Terra. But those were observations through narrow windows, like looking at an ocean through a porthole. This was drowning. The warp stretched in every direction, not physical directions because space didn't work properly here, but dimensions that my enhanced perception could process even if my normal brain couldn't. It looked like an ocean of light and darkness mixed together, constantly churning, eternally in motion. Currents of emotion made visible, storms of thought given form. And it was alive. Not alive in the way organisms are alive, but alive in the way that a collective unconscious would be alive if given substance. The warp was humanity's psychic reflection made manifest. Every emotion, every thought, every dream and nightmare that had ever existed pooled together and swirling in dimensions adjacent to real space. Beautiful and horrible in equal measure. Focus! Hadrian's voice cut through my awe. Don't just look at it, see it, perceive the currents, find the path. I forced my attention away from the overwhelming totality and focused on the task. Navigation. That's what I was here for, not sightseeing in hell. The currents became visible once I focused, streams of relatively stable warp energy flowing in semi-predictable patterns. They looked like rivers if rivers could flow upward, sideways, and through themselves simultaneously. Following them would keep us moving in the right direction. Deviating from them would send us into the turbulent zones where ships were lost. I see it, I reported, my voice barely steady. Current bearing, approximately 047, trending toward Griffon's relative position. Good, Hadrian said. Now adjust the ship's heading to follow that current. Use the throne's interface, think the adjustments, and the servitors in the bridge will respond. I thought the course correction. The Merchant's Grace turned. Its warp engines adjusting our trajectory. I felt the ship settle into the current like a boat catching a river's flow, and suddenly we were moving. Not through space, but through the warp's non-Euclidean geography, covering distances that would take years in real space in subjective hours. How long will this current remain stable? I asked. Unknown, Hadrian replied. Warp currents shift unpredictably. You'll need to constantly monitor and adjust. That's why navigation is exhausting. It's not just plotting a course, it's constantly replotting as conditions change. I settled into the rhythm. Watch the currents. Adjust heading. Watch for storms. Adjust trajectory. Repeat. Over and over every few minutes, constant vigilance because the warp didn't allow complacency. 3 hours and 40 minutes into my first shift, I saw my first demon. It appeared at the edge of my perception where the warp's currents became too turbulent to navigate safely. A presence that was simultaneously massive and infinitesimal, existing in dimensions my brain couldn't properly process but my third eye could see. It looked like hunger, not a creature that was hungry, but hunger itself given form, an absence that wanted to be filled, a void that consumed. It had no stable shape. Sometimes it appeared vaguely humanoid, sometimes serpentine, sometimes it was just teeth and reaching appendages and infinite appetite. And it was watching the merchant's grace. "Hadrian," I said, keeping my voice level through supreme effort. "Something's watching us, bearing 192 distance. I'm not sure distance works properly here, but it's close. Too close." "I see it," Hadrian replied, his own third eye blazing as he focused on the threat. "Warp predator. Minor demon, probably attracted by the psychic signature of the Geller field. Ignore it." "Ignore it?" The thing was moving closer, flowing through the warp like oil through water. "It can't breach the Geller field unless something goes catastrophically wrong. And watching it just gives it more presence in your mind. Focus on navigation. Let it observe. It'll lose interest once we're out of its territory." I tried to follow his advice, forcing my attention back to the currents, to the path, to the constant micro-adjustments that kept us moving safely. But I could still feel it watching, could sense its attention like pressure against my consciousness. The demon followed us for 18 minutes before finally departing, sliding back into the warp's depths like a shark returning to deeper waters. "You did well," Hadrian said once it was gone. "Many novices panic at their first demon sighting. You maintain navigation, that's all that matters." "How many are out there?" I asked, my voice shaking slightly now that the immediate threat had passed. "In the warp? Countless. Millions. Billions, perhaps. Most are minor, barely sentient things that exist on the edge of manifestation. But there are greater things too. Demons of the ruinous powers. Entities that predate human civilization. Things that don't have names because naming them gives them power. And we navigate through them," I said, "every voyage. Sailing through hell while things watch us and wait for us to fail." "Yes," Hadrian agreed. "Welcome to Navigator service. Your shift ends in 12 minutes. I suggest you spend that time preparing yourself for the psychological crash that comes after your first exposure." He was right about the crash. The moment my 4-hour shift ended and I closed my third eye, my body realized what it had just endured. The adrenaline that had kept me functional drained away and I collapsed in my quarters, shaking uncontrollably. I'd just spent 4 hours staring into hell. 4 hours perceiving dimensions that humans weren't designed to perceive. 4 hours watching a demon, an actual warp entity, observe our vessel with what I could only describe as malevolent curiosity. And this was a safe, routine voyage. I vomited twice before the shaking stopped. My normal eyes wouldn't focus properly. They kept trying to perceive the layers I'd been seeing with my third eye, creating double vision that made the physical world look thin and unconvincing. A medicus servitor administered something that tasted like industrial cleaner and made my thoughts slow to a manageable pace. Not quite sedation, but close, enough to stop my mind from processing the last 4 hours in real-time detail. "First shift survival rate is 96%, the servitor reported in its mechanical voice. You are within acceptable parameters. Rest is recommended. Next shift begins in 4 hours. 4 hours rest, then 4 hours navigating. Repeat for 6 weeks. This was my life now. This was what House Nostromo had bred me for. This was the gift they'd given me. I managed 3 hours of something resembling sleep before the warp dream started. I was back in the navigation chamber, but wrong. The Geller field was failing, and I could see the warp bleeding through into real space. The protective runes on the walls were cracking, breaking, allowing entities to seep through like water through a failing dam. The demon from before was there, but closer now, much closer, and it was speaking, not in words, but in concepts that imprinted directly onto my consciousness. You are thin, it said without speaking, so thin, so fragile, so temporary. We are eternal. We were here before your species learned to think. We will be here when your sun dies cold, and you sail through our realm thinking your little barriers will protect you forever. They won't. Eventually you will break. Your mind will fracture, your Geller field will fail, and we will feast on the souls within. Not today, not tomorrow. But eventually. We are patient. We have eternity. I woke screaming for the second time in my life, and the Medicae servitor was already there with more chemicals to force my brain back into something resembling functionality. Warp dreams are common among navigators, it reported. Psychological counseling is available if you experience more than 7 incidents per voyage. Current count, 1. Within acceptable parameters. 7. They allowed 7 screaming nightmares per voyage before they considered it a problem. How do veteran navigators handle this? I asked the servitor, though I didn't expect a useful answer. Veteran navigators develop coping mechanisms, it replied. Chemical dependency, psychological compartmentalization, faith-based justification frameworks, or acceptance of inevitable dissolution. Navigator Primus Hadrian utilizes all 4 simultaneously. His methods are considered effective if unorthodox. All 4 simultaneously. Drugs, insanity, religious delusion, and nihilistic acceptance. That was what 42 years of service looked like. And I'd just completed 4 hours. The Merchant's Grace was 3 weeks into the voyage when the warp storm manifested. I was on my 42nd navigation shift, 168 hours of cumulative exposure to the Immaterium, when I felt the currents begin to shift. What had been relatively stable flows started churning, becoming turbulent, the psychic equivalent of ocean waters before a hurricane. Hadrian, I reported through the Throne's Vox link, the currents are destabilizing, multiple pressure systems converging on our trajectory. I see it, his voice came back, and I could hear the tension even through the mechanical distortion. That's a warp storm, class 3, maybe 4. It wasn't there 6 hours ago, it formed while I was navigating. Either we were unlucky or something caused it. Can we navigate around it? Checking alternative routes now. A pause. Negative. The storm is expanding faster than we can maneuver. We're going to have to go through it. Through it. Through a warp storm. Through a region where the Immaterium's natural turbulence was amplified to catastrophic levels. What's the survival rate for Class 3 storms? I asked. For experienced navigators? About 60%. For novices? Hadrian didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. What do I do? Navigate. Same as you've been doing, just harder. The currents will be more violent, the visibility will be worse, and you'll need to make corrections constantly. Don't try to fight the storm, let it push us, but guide the direction of the push. Like sailing in a hurricane, you can't stop the wind, but you can use it if you're clever. And if I'm not clever enough? Then the storm tears us apart, the Geller field fails, and demons eat everyone aboard. So try to be clever. The storm hit us 40 minutes later. One moment we were navigating through standard warp turbulence. The next, Reality itself seemed to convulse, and we were in hell's center. The currents I'd been following shattered into chaos. What had been rivers became whirlpools, maelstroms, impossible geometries of force that pulled in directions that didn't exist. The entire warp seemed to be screaming, not audibly but psychically, a pressure against my consciousness that made my third eye burn with sympathetic pain. "Stabilizing," I gasped, my hands moving across the throne's interface, trying to make sense of the chaos. Trying to find a stable vector through the... A massive surge of warp energy slammed into the Merchant's Grace, sending the vessel spinning. I felt every soul aboard cry out in terror as the Geller field flickered for a fraction of a second, giving them a momentary glimpse of the Immaterium. 3 crew members died instantly. Their minds simply couldn't process what they'd perceived and shut down. I felt their souls detach from their bodies and dissolve into the warp, becoming part of the storm's churning energy. "Lucia!" Hadrian's voice cut through my shock. "I need you functional. 3 dead is acceptable losses. 3,000 isn't. Focus." I forced my attention back to navigation. The storm's geometry was incomprehensible to normal human perception, but my third eye could see patterns in the chaos. Currents within currents, stable spaces between the turbulent zones. It was like trying to thread a needle while the needle was moving and the thread was alive and everything was on fire, but it was possible. Maybe. "Adjusting heading," I reported, guiding the Merchant's Grace toward what looked like a calmer region. "Bearing 279, riding the storm's edge rather than fighting through the center." "Good thinking," Hadrian approved. "Let the storm do the work. We just need to survive it." We entered the calmer region, calmer being relative. It was still more turbulent than the worst normal warp conditions, and I thought we might actually make it through. Then I saw them. The daemons came with the storm, not the minor predator I'd seen before, but something worse. Multiple entities drawn by the storm's psychic turbulence like sharks to blood. They materialized at the edge of the Geller field, testing it, probing for weaknesses, waiting for an opportunity to breach. Most were barely formed things, masses of teeth and hunger and malevolence that lacked stable shapes. But 3 were different, more defined, more real. Demons of Zanch, I'd later learn, the chaos god of change and sorcery and forbidden knowledge. They looked like masses of eyes and wings and colors that hurt to perceive, constantly shifting between forms, never quite solid but never quite ephemeral. And they were looking at me. Not at the ship, at me specifically. Through the Geller field, through the protective runes directly at my third eye with attention that felt like being dissected. "Navigator," one of them spoke directly into my mind. Not words. Concepts imprinted onto my consciousness. "You see us. You perceive what should not be perceived. You are touched by the warp already. Why do you resist? Why not open yourself to true sight?" "Ignore them," Hadrian commanded, his voice sharp. "They're trying to distract you. Focus on navigation." But I couldn't ignore them. They were too close, too real, too interested. One of them pressed against the Geller field, and I felt the protective barrier strain under the pressure. "We could show you such things," the demon continued. "The warp's true nature, the currents of fate, the patterns that govern reality. You glimpse fragments through your third eye. We could give you complete vision. All you need to do is let us in." "No," I said aloud, though my voice shook. "Why not? You're already damned. Your soul is already marked by warp exposure. Every voyage carves away pieces of you, feeding them to us. We're simply offering to make the process less painful. Join us willingly and we'll preserve what matters. Resist and you'll dissolve slowly over decades of service." I said no. "Then you'll die here." The demon's presence intensified, and suddenly all 3 were pressing against the Geller field simultaneously. The storm will last another 6 subjective hours. Your field generator will fail in 4, and when it does, we'll feast on everyone aboard, unless you let us in now. Give us 1 soul, yours, and we'll spare the others. Lucia, Hadrian's voice was urgent now. Whatever they're offering, refuse, they're lying. Demons always lie. They're saying the Geller field will fail in 4 hours, I reported, maintaining navigation even as I spoke. Is that true? Silence on the Vox for 3 seconds, then. The field generator is showing stress fractures. 4 hours might be optimistic, but if you let them in, everyone dies. At least fighting gives us a chance. Some chance, I muttered. A 0.3% chance, the demon helpfully supplied. We can see the threads of fate. This ship is doomed. You are doomed. Everyone aboard is doomed. The only variable is whether you die resisting futilely or accepting the inevitable. I looked at the demons with my third eye, really looked, seeing them as they actually were rather than how they presented themselves. And I realized something. They were afraid, not of us. Not of the ship, but of something else. Something about this encounter that made them want to corrupt me specifically rather than simply waiting for the Geller field to fail naturally. You're lying, I said slowly. The field isn't going to fail. Or if it is, you're not confident you can breach it even if it does. You need me to let you in voluntarily because that's the only way you can actually access the ship. The demon's presence shifted, their offered visions becoming more threatening than seductive. Clever, they admitted. Clever enough to understand, but not clever enough to accept the obvious solution. You're doomed, Navigator. If not today, then tomorrow. If not this voyage, then the next. The warp claims all who touch it. We're offering you a choice in how you're claimed. Then I choose to make you work for it, I replied, and closed off my mind to their whispers. The effort of simultaneously navigating through a warp storm and resisting demonic corruption nearly broke me. My body started shutting down around the 3-hour mark. The throne's medical systems detected cascading organ failure and began injecting stimulants directly into my bloodstream, forcing my enhanced physiology to keep functioning despite every biological indicator suggesting I should be dead. My mind wasn't much better. The constant exposure to the storm's psychic turbulence was literally eroding my consciousness. I could feel pieces of myself dissolving, memories becoming vague, emotional responses dulling, the boundaries between my identity and the warp's collective unconscious becoming blurred. But I kept navigating. Because 3,000 souls aboard the Merchant's Grace were depending on me not breaking. Because Hadrian was right, giving up meant everyone died. Because somewhere beneath the exhaustion and the pain and the slow dissolution of my sense of self, I was too stubborn to let demons win through offering me mercy. 3 hours, 42 minutes, Hadrian reported. The storm is weakening. We're almost through. Just hold on a little longer. I was beyond words by that point. I'd stopped being able to form coherent language around the 3-hour mark, my consciousness too fragmented to organize thoughts into speech. But I could still navigate, could still adjust headings, follow currents, guide the ship through the diminishing chaos. The demons watched the entire time, their presence a constant pressure against the Geller field, waiting for me to falter. I didn't. At 3 hours and 57 minutes, we emerged from the storm into relatively calm warp currents. The daemons departed immediately, sliding back into the Immaterium's depths with what I could only interpret as disappointment. Stand down from navigation, Hadrian ordered. I'm taking over. You're done. I tried to disengage from the throne, but my body wouldn't respond. The stimulants had kept me functional during the crisis, but now that the immediate danger had passed, I was paying the price. Multiple organs were failing. My nervous system was in cascade shutdown. My third eye was bleeding, actual blood running down my face from where the extended exposure had literally damaged the physical tissue. The last thing I remember before losing consciousness was Hadrian's voice. Medical emergency. Navigator down. Severe warp exposure trauma. Get the chirurgeons to the navigation chamber immediately. Then darkness and silence, and the blessed absence of sight beyond sight. I woke up 6 days later in the Merchant's Grace's Medici Bay. My body was wrapped in so many bandages and connected to so many life support systems that I looked more like a servitor than a human. The chirurgeons had rebuilt approximately 40% of my internal organs, replaced 3 liters of blood, and installed temporary augmetic support for my nervous system while my enhanced physiology slowly regenerated the damage. "You survived," Hadrian said from beside my bed. He looked worse than I'd ever seen him. His own exposure during the storm's aftermath had taken its toll. 4 hours continuous navigation through a Class 4 warp storm while resisting demonic corruption. That's actually impressive. Most veteran navigators couldn't do that. "Did we make it?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "We're 2 days from Griffon 4 translation point. Yes, we made it. Thanks to you." He paused. "And 3 crew members who died in the initial impact, plus another 17 who succumbed to warp exposure during the storm. But 3,000 plus survived because you held that navigation for 4 hours. 20 dead to save 3,000. Acceptable losses by Imperial standards." I wanted to feel something about those numbers. Grief, guilt, satisfaction at the lives saved. But there was nothing. The storm had carved away the parts of me that processed emotion properly, leaving only function. "How long until I'm operational again?" I asked. "The chirurgeons estimate 2 weeks for your organic components to stabilize, another week for full psychological evaluation. You'll miss the return voyage, but House Nostromo is sending another ship to collect you." 2 weeks, I repeated. 2 weeks of recovery for 4 hours of service. The mathematics were getting worse. "Lucia," Hadrian said quietly, "you should be proud. You navigated through conditions that would have killed most navigators and saved everyone aboard. That's what we do. That's why we matter." "We save people by slowly killing ourselves," I replied. "Piece by piece, voyage by voyage, until there's nothing left except the function." "Yes," he agreed, "but the alternative is not having navigators at all. And without us, the Imperium fragments. Humanity becomes isolated on individual worlds, and the galaxy consumes us. We're slaves to our gift, but at least we're useful slaves." He stood to leave, then paused at the doorway. "For what it's worth, you'll make a fine navigator. You have the stubbornness required to last longer than most, maybe even 20 years if you're lucky and careful." 20 years. I was 12 years old and my career expectancy was 20 years. I'd be 32 when I broke, if I was lucky. "Get some rest," Hadrian said. "The warp doesn't stop just because we're tired. There will be other voyages, other storms, other demons, and we'll navigate through all of them because that's what navigators do." He left and I was alone with my thoughts and the medical servitors monitoring my recovery. I thought about the demon's offer. The promise of preserved consciousness in exchange for voluntary corruption. It had been a lie, obviously. Demons always lied. But part of it had been true. I was already damned. My soul was already marked by warp exposure. Every voyage carved away pieces of me, feeding them to the Immaterium. The only question was how long I could maintain the illusion of remaining whole. 20 years, Hadrian estimated. 20 years of serving the Imperium, 20 years of staring into hell while hell stared back. 20 years of watching my consciousness dissolve piece by piece. and then retirement, locked in a comfortable cell while what remained of my mind slowly finished disintegrating. That was my future. That was every navigator's future. We were weapons with built-in obsolescence, valuable only until we broke, then discarded to make room for the next generation of genetic aberrations who would repeat the cycle. "The Emperor protects," I whispered to the empty room, testing the words. They felt hollow. Because he didn't protect, not really. He just used us until we were used up, then moved on to the next sacrifice. That was the reality of being a navigator. And I'd only just begun to understand how doomed I truly was. I returned to House Nostromo's fortress estate on Terra 4 months after my first voyage. The recovery had taken longer than anticipated. The chirurgeons had repaired my physical damage efficiently enough, but the psychological trauma from 4 hours of continuous warp storm navigation proved more difficult to address. I developed what the Medicae called warp echo syndrome, a condition where my third eye continued perceiving Immaterium phenomena even when firmly bandaged and grounded in real space. I saw ghosts everywhere, not literal ghosts, though those existed too, but psychic impressions. Every human I passed left traces in reality, emotional residue that my damaged perception couldn't stop processing. The fortress corridors were thick with centuries of accumulated psychic waste, fear, ambition, despair, the slow, grinding hopelessness of navigators who knew exactly what awaited them. "It will fade," the house's master alienist assured me during one of my twice-daily therapy sessions. His name was Thorn, and he'd been treating traumatized navigators for 90 years. "The warp echo is common after severe exposure. Your third eye is oversensitized, perceiving too much, unable to filter properly. With time and training, you'll regain control." "And if I don't?" I asked. "Then we classify you as warp-touched and retire you early," he replied with the clinical detachment of someone who delivered that diagnosis hundreds of times. "But you're only 12. Your mind is still plastic enough to adapt. I've seen worse cases recover." "How many worse cases?" I pressed. Thorn consulted his data slate. "Of the 47 navigators who've experienced Class 4 storms or equivalent trauma, 17 recovered sufficiently for continued service. 23 were retired within 6 months. 7 are currently undergoing extended treatment with uncertain prognosis. 40% recovery rate. Better than I'd expected, honestly." "What happened to the ones who were retired?" I asked, though I suspected I knew. "They live in the quietest wing," Thorn said. "The house's retirement facility for navigators whose minds have become incompatible with active service. They're comfortable there, well cared for. Some even achieve a form of peace with their condition." "Can I see them?" Thorn's expression suggested this was an unusual request. "That's generally not recommended. The quietest wing can be distressing for active navigators. Seeing your potential future so explicitly is not conducive to maintaining the psychological resilience required for service." "I want to see them anyway," I insisted. He studied me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Very well. Perhaps confronting the reality will be therapeutic in its own way. I'll arrange a visit." The quietest wing occupied the deepest levels of House Nostromo's fortress, buried so far underground that even my enhanced senses couldn't detect the surface. The walls were thick with psychic shielding, far more extensive than the standard protective wards, creating a space where the warp's influence was minimized to near imperceptibility. "The shielding is necessary," Thorn explained as we descended through multiple security checkpoints. "Many of the residents are unable to close their third eyes anymore. Without heavy shielding, they'd be constantly exposed to the warp's psychic pressure. Some would attract demonic attention. Others would simply disintegrate under the constant stimulus. Unable to close their third eyes? I repeated. I thought the bandanas are physical barriers. They help, but they don't actually close the eye. Most navigators retain enough control to limit their perception voluntarily. The residents here have lost that control. Their third eyes are permanently open, perceiving the Immaterium constantly, unable to stop. We reached the Quietus Wing's entrance, a massive door inscribed with enough protective runes to shield a cathedral. Beyond it, I could sense something, a collection of presences that felt simultaneously human and other. Remember, Thorn said before opening the door. These were all active navigators once. Some had distinguished careers spanning decades. They're not monsters or failures. They're simply what happens when the gift breaks us completely. He opened the door. The Quietus Wing was arranged like a hospital, but worse. Individual cells lined both sides of a long corridor, each one sealed behind transparent armor glass that let observers see in but prevented the residents from leaving. Inside each cell was a navigator who'd broken in some fundamental way. The first one we passed was a woman who looked perhaps 40 chronologically, but whose soul was ancient. She sat in the corner of her cell, third eye wide open, staring at something only she could see. Her lips moved constantly, whispering in a language that made my head hurt to hear. Not low Gothic or high Gothic, but something older. Something that predated human language. Navigator Tertius Cassidy, Thorn identified her. 32 years of service. Broke during a routine voyage when she perceived something in the warp that her mind couldn't process. She's been speaking in that language for 11 years. We don't know what it means. We're not sure we want to know. The next cell contained a man who was actively screaming. Not in pain or fear, but just screaming. A continuous sound that never paused for breath because he'd somehow learned to breathe and scream simultaneously. His third eye blazed with sickly light, tears of blood running down his face. Navigator Primus Horvath, Thorn said. 47 years of service. The longest career in House Nostromo's recent history. He broke during his final voyage 3 years ago. The screaming started immediately and has never stopped. We've tried everything. Sedation, psychic dampening, even considering surgical removal of his third eye. Nothing stops it. Why not just kill him? I asked quietly. Isn't that more merciful? House Nostromo does not kill its navigators, Thorn replied firmly. Our genes are too valuable. Even broken navigators can produce viable offspring who might carry the gift to the next generation. Horvath has already sired 12 children through house breeding programs. His genetic contribution justifies keeping him alive despite his condition. Breeding programs, they were using broken navigators as genetic stock. How many children am I expected to produce? I asked. That depends on your career length and genetic quality assessments, Thorn replied clinically. Active navigators typically contribute genetic material twice yearly. Retired navigators like these residents may contribute more frequently since they're not exposed to further warp damage. Your particular bloodline is considered high value, strong third eye, good warp resistance, above average career longevity prediction. You'll likely be expected to produce between 20 and 30 offspring over your lifetime. 20 to 30 children I'd never know. Created through clinical extraction and artificial gestation, raised by the house to potentially carry the same curse I carried. The genetic exploitation was almost worse than the warp exposure. We continued through the Quietus Wing, past cell after cell of broken navigators. One woman had carved runes into her own flesh, protective wards that had failed to protect her from whatever she'd seen. She sat surrounded by the blood drawings, third eye wide, watching entities that existed only in her perception. One man was frozen in place, his body locked in rigor while his third eye continued to move, tracking invisible objects. He'd been like that for 6 years, fed through tubes, kept alive despite being effectively catatonic. One navigator, gender indeterminate due to extensive mutation, had physically transformed. Their skin had taken on a faintly translucent quality, and I could see the warp moving beneath it like oil under glass. They were slowly becoming more warp than flesh, transitioning from physical to psychic existence. That's what happens to navigators who serve too long, Thorne explained. The warp doesn't just damage us psychologically. Extended exposure causes physical transformation. We become more like what we navigate through. Eventually, the distinction between navigator and warp entity becomes unclear. How long is too long? I asked. Generally, transformation begins around year 25 of active service. It's one reason why the average career is only 15 years. We retire navigators before the physical changes become irreversible. Those who serve longer, he gestured to the transforming navigator, become this, still alive, still technically human, but not really either. We reached the end of the corridor where a single large cell occupied the entire back wall. Inside was someone I recognized. Navigator Matriarch Meridian, my mother's predecessor, the legendary navigator who'd served for 52 years before finally breaking. She'd been a myth when I was younger. Stories of impossible navigations, routes no other navigator could perceive, journeys through warp storms that should have been unsurvivable. And now she was here. Meridian looked ancient, though chronologically she was probably only 90. 52 years of warp exposure had aged her in ways that went beyond cellular degradation. Her third eye was enormous. It had grown to dwarf her normal eyes, taking up most of her forehead, pulsing with light that illuminated the cell in shifting colors. But worse than the physical changes was what I saw with my own third eye. Her soul was barely there. 52 years of warp exposure had carved away at least 90% of her original essence. What remained was held together not by willpower or augmetics, but by the warp itself. She'd become so saturated with Immaterium energy that she was effectively a living warp conduit, reality thinning around her in ways that made my danger sense scream warnings. Meridian is our oldest living navigator, Thorne said quietly, with something approaching reverence. She volunteered to continue serving beyond all reasonable limits because the house needed her expertise. She navigated routes that saved billions of lives. And this is what it cost her. Meridian's massive third eye focused on me, and I felt her attention like a physical weight. Child. Her voice entered my mind directly, bypassing conventional speech. You've seen the warp's true face, the storms, the demons, the slow dissolution that awaits us all. Yes, I said aloud, unsure if she could hear conventional sound anymore. And yet you continue. Why? Because I struggled for an answer that made sense. Because people depend on us. Because without navigators, the Imperium falls. Because my genes compel me to serve. Wrong. Meridian's mental voice was sad. You continue because you haven't yet understood the truth. We are not serving the Imperium. We are feeding it. Our souls are fuel for a machine that will consume us and move on to the next generation without pause. Then why did you serve for 52 years? I challenged. Because I believed the lie, she admitted. I thought that exceptional service would mean something. That breaking records, saving lives, navigating impossible routes would give my sacrifice meaning. But I was wrong. The Imperium doesn't remember service. It only demands more until there's nothing left to give. Her third eye brightened, and suddenly I could see what she saw. Layers upon layers of warp perception, timelines branching and converging, the threads of fate that govern Navigator existence. I saw my own future spread before me, multiple branching paths, but all of them ended the same way. Here, in cells like these, are broken and exploited and used until even the genetic material was exhausted. You have 20 years, perhaps, Meridian showed me. Maybe 25 if you're fortunate. The storms will carve you away piece by piece. The demons will whisper until you can't distinguish their voices from your own thoughts. And eventually you'll either break completely or transform into something that's no longer quite human. Then what should I do? I asked desperately. If service leads only to this, what choice do I have? None, she replied simply. We have no choices. We're genetic aberrations that the Imperium has weaponized. Our only options are to serve until we break, or to break early and spend more years in places like this. Either way, the warp claims us. There has to be another way, I insisted. There isn't, Meridian said. I spent 52 years looking for alternatives. There are none. We are doomed from the moment our third eye opens. The only variable is how long we delay the inevitable. Her presence withdrew from my mind, and she returned to staring at the warp phenomena only she could perceive. That's enough for today, Thorn said, guiding me away from Meridian's cell. You've seen what you asked to see. The Quietus Wing. The ultimate destination for all navigators who served long enough. Does it change anything? I thought about the question as we ascended back toward the inhabited levels of the fortress. No, I finally admitted. It doesn't change anything. I'll still serve. Because there's no alternative. Because my genes compel it. Because 20 years of function is better than immediate retirement to the Quietus Wing. That's the conclusion most navigators reach, Thorn said. The doomed reality we all accept. We serve knowing exactly what awaits us because the alternative is unacceptable. How do you bear it? I asked him. Watching generation after generation of navigators come through here, all of them doomed, all of them aware of their doom and being unable to offer them anything except extended function before inevitable dissolution? Thorn was silent for a long moment as we reached the surface levels. I don't bear it well, he finally admitted. I've been treating traumatized navigators for 90 years, and I've developed my own coping mechanisms. Chemical dependency mostly, and the belief, probably delusional, that my work matters. That helping navigators function for a few more years before they break somehow justifies my existence. Does it? I asked. I don't know anymore, he said. But I keep doing it anyway. Just like you'll keep navigating. Just like every navigator keeps serving despite knowing how it ends. Because in the Imperium, we're all doomed. Some of us just see our doom more clearly than others. They came for my genetic material 6 months after my first voyage. I'd recovered sufficiently from the warp echo syndrome to be cleared for active service again, though the master alienist had noted in my file that I showed persistent oversensitivity to psychic phenomena and above-average awareness of existential doom. These were apparently common traits among navigators and not considered disqualifying. The summons came from the house's Genetic Preservation Division, a bureaucratic name for the department responsible for ensuring navigator bloodlines continued despite our high attrition rate. Navigator Novice Lucia Nostromo, the gene matron, greeted me in her sterile office. She was old, perhaps 200 years, kept alive through extensive juvenate treatments and augmetics. Her own navigator heritage was obvious in the slight bulge of her forehead where a third eye had once been before she'd had it surgically removed and replaced with a bionic implant. You had your third eye removed, I observed, unable to hide my surprise. I'd never heard of a navigator voluntarily removing their warp eye. I served for 32 years before my mind began fracturing, she replied matter-of-factly. The choice was retirement to the Quietus Wing or surgical removal and reassignment to house service. I chose the latter. I'm more useful here, managing the genetic programs, than I would be screaming in a cell. Can all navigators do that? I asked. Remove the eye and end the warp exposure? Theoretically, yes. Practically, no. The surgery is expensive, extremely dangerous, and leaves the navigator blind to the warp, which means we're no longer useful for our primary purpose. The House permits it only for navigators who've already completed their service obligations and shown exceptional value in other capacities. For someone your age, it's not an option. She pulled up my genetic profile on her data screen. I saw my bloodline traced back through 17 generations. Notation markers highlighting which traits the House considered valuable and which were concerning. Your maternal line is exceptional, the gene matron noted. Navigator matriarch Cassandra's career spans 3 centuries, one of the longest active service records in any navigator house. Your paternal genetics are equally valuable. Navigator Primus Aldrich served for 28 years before retirement, well above average. The combination produces offspring with strong third eyes, good warp resistance, and psychological resilience. You're saying I'm good breeding stock, I said bluntly. I'm saying your genetic material is valuable enough to justify aggressive preservation protocols, she corrected. You're currently 12 years old, biologically viable for reproduction, and cleared for genetic extraction. The standard protocol is extraction twice yearly for active navigators, with the material preserved for future breeding programs. And I don't have a choice in this, I said. Not a question. You have the choice all navigators have, the gene matron replied. Serve the House's needs, including genetic contribution, and maintain your active service status, or refuse, be classified as non-compliant and face immediate retirement. Since you're too young to have completed minimum service obligations, retirement would mean assignment to the Quietus Wing despite being functional. Serve or be imprisoned, the Imperium's favorite choice. When does extraction happen? I asked. Today. The medici servitors are prepared. The procedure is minimally invasive, takes approximately 30 minutes, and you'll be cleared to return to normal activities within an hour. Subsequent extractions will follow the same protocol every 6 months for the duration of your active service. And what happens to the genetic material? It's preserved in stasis until breeding matches are determined. The House's genealogists analyze genetic compatibility across all navigator bloodlines, identifying optimal pairings that maximize desirable traits while minimizing negative mutations. Your material will likely be paired with multiple matches over the years, producing offspring who'll be raised by the House and trained as the next generation of navigators. How many children will I have? I asked. The gene matron consulted her records. Based on current projections and assuming average career longevity between 20 and 35 offspring. If you serve longer than average, like your mother, potentially 50 or more. The exact number depends on how many viable matches the genealogists identify and how long you remain in active service. 50 children I'd never meet. 50 genetic copies carrying my curse forward into the future. 50 more navigators doomed to repeat the cycle. What if I wanted to meet them? I asked. The children created from my genetics? That's generally discouraged, the gene matron said. Parent-child bonds between genetic donors and offspring can create emotional complications that interfere with the House's training protocols. Navigator children are raised communally, educated by House instructors, and conditioned to view the House itself as their family rather than individual genetic donors. So I'm not a parent. I'm just genetic raw material. You're a navigator, she replied. Your primary value is navigation. Everything else, including reproduction, is simply optimization of that primary resource. The House has maintained Navigator bloodlines for 8,000 years through these protocols. They work. The extraction procedure was exactly as clinical as I'd expected. Medici servitors performed the process in a sterile chamber that smelled of disinfectant and the particular chemical odor of stasis preservation. They harvested genetic material with mechanical efficiency, cataloged it, processed it for long-term storage, and updated my file to reflect the extraction. 30 minutes, as promised. I was 12 years old, and the Imperium had just turned me into a breeding resource. "You're clear to resume normal activities," the servitor informed me in its mechanical voice. "Next scheduled extraction in 6 months. Compliance is mandatory. Non-compliance will result in immediate service termination and reassignment to restricted facilities." I left the extraction chamber feeling hollowed out in ways that had nothing to do with the physical procedure. I found my mother in the house's observation deck, staring out at Terra's polluted skyline through armor glass that filtered the worst of the toxic atmosphere. "They took my genetic material today," I said without preamble. She didn't turn from the view. "I know, it's in your file. Every 6 months for the rest of your active service, standard protocol." "How many children do you have?" I asked. "Through the breeding programs?" 47, she replied, her voice emotionless. "Across 3 centuries of service. Most are dead now. The Navigator career is hazardous, but 17 are still serving in various houses. I've met 3 of them briefly during house gatherings. They're strangers who share my genetics but nothing else. Does it bother you? It did when I was younger, when I still thought of myself as a person rather than a resource. But 3 centuries of service teaches you to accept the mathematics. The house needs genetic material. I have valuable genetics, therefore I contribute. Everything else is sentiment that accomplishes nothing." She turned to face me, and I saw the exhaustion in her eyes, the accumulation of 300 years navigating through hell, watching pieces of herself dissolve into the warp, and continuing anyway because there was no alternative. "You're angry," she observed, "about the breeding protocols, about being treated as genetic raw material instead of a person with autonomy." "Shouldn't I be?" I challenged. "Perhaps. But anger changes nothing. You'll still report for extractions every 6 months. You'll still contribute genetic material whether you're angry or resigned or delighted. The only variable is how much emotional energy you waste on resentment." "So I should just accept it," I said bitterly. "Accept that I'm a resource to be exploited. Accept that I'll have 50 children I'll never know. Accept that my entire existence is defined by what I can provide to the House and the Imperium." "Yes," she said simply. "Because the alternative is spending your life fighting a system that cannot be fought. The Houses control us completely. The Imperium sanctions that control because they need navigators. We have no leverage, no options, no escape. We can either accept our exploitation and focus on surviving as long as possible, or we can rebel futilely and be crushed. There has to be another way," I insisted, though even as I said it, I knew I was wrong. "There isn't," Mother replied. "I spent my first century of service looking for alternatives, secret organizations of navigators who'd found ways to escape, hidden protocols that would let us serve without being completely exploited, anything that would give us some measure of control over our own existence. And I found nothing. The Houses have been controlling navigators for 8,000 years. They've thought of every possible rebellion, every potential escape, every method we might use to reclaim autonomy. All the loopholes are sealed. All the alternatives are eliminated. We serve or we're imprisoned. Those are the only choices." She returned her attention to the toxic skyline. "You'll make your peace with it eventually. she continued. Or you'll break trying to resist and end up in the quietest wing decades before necessary. Either way, the breeding programs continue. The house gets what it needs from us, and the next generation of navigators is created to repeat the cycle. How do you bear it? I asked, the same question I'd asked Thorn. 300 years of this. How do you keep going? I don't know anymore, she admitted. Inertia, mostly. And the vague sense that stopping would mean admitting that all 300 years were wasted. So I continue navigating, contributing genetics, watching my children who aren't really my children enter service and eventually break, and I tell myself that it matters somehow. Does it matter? No, she said, but I pretend it does. That's the navigator's final skill, the ability to maintain functional fictions that keep us navigating despite knowing the truth. My first genetic offspring entered active service 7 years later. Her name was Mira, and she'd been created from my genetic material paired with Navigator Primus Hadrian's contribution. She was 14 years old, biologically viable for navigation, and had just completed her opening ceremony. I saw her briefly during a house gathering, a formal event where multiple generations of navigators assembled for ceremonial purposes. She looked like me, or at least like I'd looked before 7 years of warp exposure had started carving away my features. Same dark hair, same facial structure, same genetic markers that identified her as Navigator bloodline. But she was a stranger. Navigator Novice Mira, I greeted her formally because that's all the protocol allowed. Congratulations on your opening. Your genetic donors have strong service records. You have an excellent foundation. Thank you, Navigator Lucia, she replied with the rehearsed politeness of someone who'd been trained in house etiquette from birth. I hope to serve as well as my genetic lineage suggests. She had no idea I was one of her genetic donors. The information was in the house records, but they didn't tell Navigator children who their donors were unless there was specific reason to establish that connection. She saw me as just another active navigator, someone to be respected for my service record but not connected to her in any meaningful way. Your first voyage will be challenging, I told her, because I couldn't help offering advice even though she wasn't really my daughter. The warp is worse than anything they describe in training, but you'll adapt. Your genetics include strong warp resistance. You'll survive. Until I don't, she said, and I was surprised by the bleakness in her voice. You've already figured it out, I observed. The doom that awaits all navigators. I visited the quietest wing during my psychological evaluation, she admitted. They wanted to see how I'd react to seeing broken navigators. I reacted by understanding exactly what my future holds. 15 to 20 years of service, carving pieces of myself away with each voyage until I either break completely or transform into something that's barely human anymore. Then retirement to a comfortable cell where they'll continue extracting my genetic material until even that's exhausted. She met my eyes, and I saw a darkness there that shouldn't exist in a 14-year-old. We're doomed, she said. All of us. The moment our third eye opens, we're doomed. And the house breeds more of us anyway, perpetuating the cycle because the Imperium needs navigators and our genetics are too valuable to let the bloodlines end naturally. Yes, I agreed. That's the truth they don't explicitly state, but which every navigator eventually understands. We're genetic resources being exploited across generations. Then why do we serve? She asked. If we know we're doomed, if we know the House and Imperium are exploiting us, why don't we refuse? All of us collectively. If every navigator refused to serve, the Imperium would have to negotiate, offer us better conditions, treat us as people rather than resources. It was the same fantasy I'd had at her age, the same hope that collective action might create change. Because they'd kill us all, I said bluntly. The Imperium has spent the last 8,000 years developing contingencies for exactly that scenario. They have backup Navigator houses. They have alternative faster-than-light methods that are less reliable but functional. They have the willingness to sacrifice billions of Imperial citizens to maintain control. If we refused collectively, they'd execute every Navigator, adults and children both, and rebuild from the genetic material they've stored. It would take decades, maybe centuries, but they'd do it rather than negotiate with us. So we have no leverage, Mira said. None. We're valuable but replaceable. Difficult to replace but possible. And the Imperium's timeline operates in millennia. They can afford the short-term chaos of eliminating us if it means maintaining absolute control in the long term. I watched my genetic offspring process this information, saw the hope drain from her eyes as she understood the completeness of our exploitation. Then we really are doomed, she said quietly. Yes, I agreed. We really are. Welcome to Navigator service. Your first voyage departs in 6 weeks. Try to survive it. That night I had warp dreams for the first time in months. I was in a ship navigating, but the currents were wrong. Instead of flowing through the Immaterium, I was flowing through time, seeing Navigator generations stacked on top of each other, stretching back to the age of strife when the first mutations appeared, and forward to some distant future where the last Navigator finally broke and the bloodlines ended. Thousands of generations, millions of Navigators, all of them doomed, all of them exploited, all of them used until they broke, then replaced by the next generation who would repeat the cycle. And in the center of this temporal vision, I saw the truth. The Navigator houses weren't preserving bloodlines out of loyalty or tradition. They were farming us, cultivating genetic aberrations, harvesting the useful mutations, culling the failures, and perpetuating the cycle because it was profitable. We weren't a noble class of essential servants. We were livestock with delusions of importance. I woke up screaming as I had 7 years ago during my first warp dream. But this time, no one came to comfort me, because everyone in House Nostromo knew the truth. We were all doomed, and screaming about it changed nothing. I reported for my next voyage the following week. The Imperial Destiny, a Navy frigate carrying supplies to a forward base near the Cicatrix Maledictum. Standard 6-week voyage, Class 2 hazard rating, acceptable survival probability. I navigated for 4-hour shifts, watched the warp's horrors, resisted demonic whispers, and guided the ship safely to its destination. Then I returned to Terra, reported for genetic extraction, and was told that I'd contributed to the creation of 3 new Navigator embryos who would be decanted in 9 months and trained to repeat the cycle. My genetic offspring. Children I'd never know. Navigators I'd doomed to the same fate that awaited me. The gene matron congratulated me on my exceptional genetic contribution. I said nothing, because what was there to say? We were all doomed, and the breeding continued anyway, forever, or until the Imperium finally fell and the warp consumed everything, whichever came first. I was 19 years old, subjectively 34, when I navigated the eternal vigil through what should have been a routine voyage to the Segmentum Obscurus and saw something in the warp that changed everything. Or perhaps it was always there, and I'd simply reached the point in my degradation where I could finally perceive it. The voyage started normally. The Eternal Vigil was an ancient vessel, its hull inscribed with protective wards dating back to the Great Crusade, carrying a delegation of administratum officials to assess tithe compliance on 17 systems. 8 weeks transit time, Class 2 hazard rating, the kind of voyage I'd completed dozens of times. I was on my 47th hour of navigation, day 12 of the voyage, when my third eye began perceiving layers beneath the warp's normal horror. At first, I thought it was warp echo syndrome returning. The condition had never fully healed. I still perceived psychic phenomena more intensely than other navigators, saw details they missed, felt the Immaterium's texture with uncomfortable clarity. But this was different. Beneath the warp's churning surface, beneath the demons and the currents and the emotional storms, there was structure. "Navigator Primus Hadrian," I said through the throne's vox, my voice uncertain. "Are you perceiving anything unusual in the warp substrate? Approximately bearing 347 depth? I'm not sure depth is the right terminology, but deeper than normal perception allows." Hadrian had been my mentor for 7 years now. We'd navigated together on 17 voyages, and he'd become something approaching a friend, insofar as navigators could have friends rather than simply co-workers united by shared doom. "Define unusual," he replied. "The warp is entirely unusual by any rational standard." "Patterns," I tried to explain. "Not natural patterns like currents or storms, but designed patterns, intentional structure, like someone built something underneath the warp's surface and I'm seeing the foundation." Silence on the vox for several seconds. "Lucia," Hadrian said carefully, "you're describing phenomena that shouldn't be perceivable. The warp doesn't have a substrate or foundation. It's not constructed. It's emergent chaos resulting from psychic impressions. There's nothing underneath it." "I know what I'm seeing," I insisted, focusing my third eye deeper. "There are structures, geometries that don't match natural warp formation. They look almost like—" The warp convulsed, not metaphorically. The entire Immaterium around the eternal vigil rippled like disturbed water, and suddenly I could see it clearly. A massive architectural structure existing in dimensions that shouldn't exist, built from materials that weren't quite matter and weren't quite energy. It looked like a web, a three-dimensional, no, four-dimensional, no, the number of dimensions kept shifting. Web that stretched through the warp's depths, connecting points across impossible distances. And at each intersection of the web there was something that looked like a node, a junction, a place where multiple strands converged. "What is that?" I whispered. "What is what?" Hadrian demanded. "Lucia, you're concerning me. What are you perceiving?" "The webway," a voice said that wasn't Hadrian's, wasn't coming through the vox at all, was speaking directly into my mind through my third eye's perception. "You're perceiving the webway, human. And that means you're seeing far deeper than your species should be capable of." I tried to close my third eye to shut out the voice, but I'd been navigating for 47 hours and my control was deteriorating. The eye stayed open, perceiving the structure, and the voice continued. "The webway is Eldari construction," the voice explained with the patience of someone addressing a child. "A network of tunnels through the warp, shielded from its worst effects, allowing travel without the dangers your crude warp drives force you to endure. It's ancient. It predates your Imperium by millennia. And you're not supposed to be able to see it." "Who are you?" I asked aloud, aware that I was probably having a psychotic break and talking to a hallucination. "I am Farseer Eldorath," the voice replied. "And I have been watching your species' Navigator cast with interest for several centuries. Most of you are blind even with your third eyes open. You see the warp's surface but not its depths. You are different. You see too much. That makes you dangerous." "Lucia," Hadrian's voice cut through the Farseer's words. "You're talking to yourself. Your vital signs are spiking. I'm ending your shift. Disengage from navigation immediately." "Wait," I said, not sure if I was addressing Hadrian or the voice. "If I'm seeing something I shouldn't, I need to understand what it means." "It means," Eldorath replied, "that your mutation has progressed beyond what your Imperium intends. Standard navigators see enough to guide ships through the warp, but not enough to understand the Immaterium's true nature. You're developing deeper sight, and deeper sight means perceiving things the Imperium would prefer you remain ignorant of." "Like what?" "Like the fact that the Astronomicon, the psychic beacon your Emperor maintains to guide your ships, is not actually what your Imperium claims it is." The statement hit me like a physical blow. "The Astronomicon is the Emperor's light," I said, reciting the doctrine I'd been taught since childhood. "It guides us through the warp. It's the foundation of all navigator navigation." "No," Eldorath corrected gently. "The Astronomicon is a psychic lighthouse powered by 10,000 sacrificed souls daily. It does provide guidance. But it's not divine illumination. It's the largest psychic scream in the galaxy, burning so bright that even your limited third eyes can perceive it through the warp's interference. You're not following holy light. You're following the death screams of thousands of psychers being immolated to maintain the Imperium's infrastructure." "That's not—" I started, then stopped, because my third eye could see it now. Really see it. Perceiving the Astronomicon's true nature rather than the filtered version I'd been trained to recognize. And Eldorath was right. The light I'd been following my entire career wasn't divine. It was anguish made visible. 10,000 souls burning simultaneously, their psychic death throes amplified and directed by the Emperor's will into a beacon that screamed across the warp. I'd been navigating by following the sound of eternal dying. "Lucia!" Hadrian's voice was screaming now. "Disengage! You're going catatonic!" I tried to respond, but my consciousness was fragmenting. The combination of extended navigation, warp echo syndrome, and suddenly perceiving the Astronomicon's true nature was too much for my already damaged psyche to process. I felt the throne's medical systems activate, injecting sedatives and neural stabilizers directly into my bloodstream. My third eye began to close, not voluntarily but chemically forced shut as the sedatives overrode my voluntary control. The last thing I perceived before losing consciousness was Eldorath's voice. "Remember what you've seen, Navigator. Remember that everything you've been told is a comfortable lie, and when you're ready to know more, simply look deeper during your next voyage. The truth is always visible to those with the courage to perceive it." Then darkness and silence and the blessed absence of sight beyond sight. I woke up 4 days later in the Eternal Vigil's Medici Bay. Hadrian was there, looking worse than I'd ever seen him. 50 years of service had carved away most of his soul, but the concern in what remained was genuine. "You went catatonic," he said without preamble. 47 hours of continuous navigation, then sudden psychological collapse. You've been unconscious for 96 hours. The chirurgeons weren't sure you'd wake up. "I saw something," I said, my voice hoarse from disuse. "In the warp, structures, a voice, the Astronomicon's true nature." Hadrian's expression shifted from concern to something darker. Fear, perhaps, or recognition. "What exactly did you see?" he asked carefully. I told him. The webway structure, the Farseer's voice, the revelation about the Astronomicon being powered by 10,000 daily sacrifices rather than divine light. When I finished, Hadrian was silent for a long moment. "That's deep sight," he finally said. "Perception beyond what navigator training provides. It's rare. Maybe one navigator in 1,000 develops it, usually after 20 or more years of service. You've developed it after only 7 years. That's problematic." "Problematic how?" "Because navigators with deep sight see too much. They perceive the Imperium's foundational lies. They understand that we're not actually following the Emperor's blessed light, but following the psychic equivalent of a distress beacon. They realize that everything we've been told about our purpose is propaganda designed to keep us compliant. He leaned forward, his tattered soul visible to my enhanced perception. The houses know about deep sight, he continued quietly. They track which navigators develop it, and they have protocols. What kind of protocols? Retirement, immediate and permanent. Navigators with deep sight are too dangerous to remain in active service. They might share what they've seen with other navigators, might inspire questioning or resistance, might destabilize the careful fictions that keep us navigating despite knowing we're doomed. So I'll be sent to the quietest wing, I said, at 19, because I saw too much. Unless you lie, Hadrian said. Tell them you experienced warp-induced hallucinations during extended navigation, that you saw demons and phantoms but nothing real, except increased medical oversight and chemical stabilization. Promise to never navigate for more than 4 hours without break again. And most importantly, never speak about what you saw to anyone except me. You're asking me to lie to the house, I said slowly. I'm asking you to survive, Hadrian corrected. Because the truth you've seen will get you imprisoned if you share it. The House can't allow navigators to know that the Astronomicon is powered by daily human sacrifice. Can't risk us understanding that we're following death screams rather than holy light. The psychological impact would shatter the navigator caste's willingness to serve. Have you seen it? I asked. Do you have deep sight? I've had it for 12 years, he admitted. Since year 38 of my service. I saw the same things you saw, the webway, the Astronomicon's true nature, all of it. And I made the same choice I'm asking you to make. Lie, survive, and keep navigating while pretending I don't know the truth. How do you bear it? I asked for the third time in my life, asking the question that defined navigator existence. How do you navigate knowing that everything we've been told is a lie? Poorly, he said. I bear it poorly. The chemical dependency you've probably noticed isn't just for managing warp exposure. It's to suppress the psychological horror of knowing the truth while continuing to function anyway. But bearing it poorly is better than being locked in the quietest wing for the next 40 years while the House harvests my genetics. He stood to leave, then paused at the doorway. You have a choice, Lucia. Tell the truth and be imprisoned, or lie and survive. Either way, you'll spend the rest of your life serving an Imperium built on lies and exploitation. The only question is whether you do it from a navigation throne or a padded cell. I chose to lie. When the House's alienists came to debrief me, I told them exactly what Hadrian had suggested. Extended navigation had caused warp-induced hallucinations. I'd seen demons that spoke to me, phantoms that showed me false visions, psychic interference that temporarily disrupted my perception. They believed me because they wanted to believe me, because accepting that I'd developed deep sight after only 7 years of service would require protocols they didn't want to implement. Easier to classify it as temporary psychosis, increase my medical oversight, and return me to service with limitations. 4-hour navigation maximum, the master alienist prescribed. Mandatory chemical stabilization before each shift, weekly psychological evaluations for 6 months, then monthly thereafter. Any recurrence of hallucinations or unusual perception must be reported immediately. I understand, I said, maintaining the lie. Your genetic contribution has been exceptional, he continued. 12 offspring so far, 11 currently in training, 1 already in active service. The House values your bloodline. We want you functional and serving for as long as possible. Don't let psychological instability jeopardize your career. I won't, I promised, knowing I was promising to maintain the lie forever. He dismissed me, satisfied that the problem had been contained. and I returned to service, navigating by following the screams of 10,000 daily sacrifices, pretending I didn't know what I was actually perceiving. The knowledge changed everything and nothing. I still navigated, still completed voyages, still contributed genetic material every 6 months, still watched my offspring enter service and begin their own doomed careers. But now I knew the truth beneath the comfortable lies. The Emperor wasn't protecting us, he was using us just as he used everything else in the Imperium, consuming resources until they were exhausted, then replacing them with the next generation. The Navigator houses weren't preserving noble bloodlines. They were farming genetic aberrations, cultivating mutations, breeding us like livestock because we were too useful to let our bloodlines end naturally. The Astronomicon wasn't holy light guiding us home. It was the psychic death scream of thousands of souls being immolated daily to maintain the Imperium's faster-than-light infrastructure. And we, the Navigators, were complicit. We served knowing we were doomed, facilitated an Imperium built on lies and exploitation, and bred new generations to continue the cycle because the alternative was unthinkable. I met with Hadrian in secret 3 weeks after my release from medical oversight. "How many Navigators have deep sight?" I asked. "How many of us know the truth?" "Unknown exactly," he replied. "The houses don't share information about deep sight across bloodlines. It's considered sensitive information that might destabilize Navigator morale if widely known. But based on the literature and my own observations, I estimate perhaps 1 in 500 to 1 in 1,000 Navigators develop it at some point in their careers." "And they all lie about it?" "The smart ones do. The ones who tell the truth either get retired immediately or disappear into classified house facilities where their dangerous knowledge can be contained. I've heard rumors of a secret facility on Luna where deep sight Navigators who refuse to comply are kept in permanent isolation. But they're just rumors." "What do we do with the knowledge?" I asked. "If we know the truth but can't share it, what's the point of knowing?" Hadrian was silent for a long moment, his expression haunted. "We bear witness," he finally said. "We navigate while knowing exactly what we're participating in. We survive as long as possible while maintaining the lie. And we hope, probably futilely, that someday, somehow, the truth will matter. That knowing the Imperium is built on lies and exploitation will lead to change rather than just being another burden we carry silently until we break." "That's not much of a purpose," I observed. "No," he agreed, "but it's all we have. Welcome to deep sight, Lucia. Welcome to knowing too much. It doesn't get easier, but you adapt to the weight eventually." "Do you ever wish you'd never developed it?" I asked. "That you'd remained ignorant like most Navigators?" "Every day," he admitted. "But ignorance isn't actually an option once you've seen the truth. You can't unsee the Astronomicon's true nature, can't unhear the screaming, can't pretend the comfortable lies are real once you know they're lies. So you adapt, or you break, or you get locked away. Those are the only choices." He stood to leave, then paused. "One more thing," he said. "The Farseer who spoke to you, Eldorath, he's real. The Eldari occasionally contact Navigators with deep sight, offering information, testing whether we're capable of perceiving truths our Imperium hides from us. If he contacts you again, be very careful. The Eldari have their own agenda, and it rarely aligns with human interests. They're not offering enlightenment out of kindness. They're assessing whether humanity's Navigator caste might be useful to them somehow. Should I refuse to listen if he contacts me again?" "I don't know," Hadrian admitted. "I've never had an Eldari contact me directly. You're the first Navigator I've met who has, which means either you're exceptionally perceptive or the Eldari see something in you specifically. Either way, be cautious. The truth they offer might be real, but their motives are their own. He left me alone with my thoughts and my deep sight and the knowledge I could never share. I lasted 6 more years before I reached my breaking point. 25 years old chronologically, 43 subjectively, with 13 years of active Navigator service. I'd completed 117 voyages, navigated through 9 major warp storms, resisted demon corruption 16 times, and contributed genetic material to create 37 offspring. By Navigator standards, I was succeeding. My career length was approaching average, my survival rate was above statistical norms, and my genetic contribution was exceptional. The house considered me a valuable asset worth maintaining for as long as possible. I considered myself a walking corpse that hadn't finished dying yet. The breaking point came during what should have been a routine voyage. The Divine Mandate was a Cardinal-class heavy cruiser transporting an ecclesiarchy delegation to the shrine world of Ophelia VII. 6-week voyage, Class 2 hazard rating, the kind of milk-run navigation that experienced navigators could complete without significant psychological strain. But I wasn't a normal experienced navigator anymore. 13 years of service combined with deep sight and warp echo syndrome that had never fully healed meant that every voyage was harder than it should be. I perceived too much, saw too deeply, understood too clearly exactly what I was doing every time I opened my third eye and stared into the Immaterium, following the screams, navigating by death, guiding the ship through hell while pretending it was holy work. The delegation included a cardinal whose name I never learned and 17 lesser ecclesiarchy officials. They held services daily in the ship's chapel, praising the Emperor's divine protection, thanking him for the light that guided us through the warp. They had no idea that the light they praised was powered by 10,000 screaming psychers being consumed daily on Terra. And I couldn't tell them. I was on my 93rd navigation shift of the voyage, day 24, nearly through the journey, when something in me simply broke. Not psychologically, though that was deteriorating too, but something more fundamental. The part of my consciousness that had been maintaining the lie, pretending the knowledge didn't matter, keeping me functional despite knowing the truth. It shattered. I was navigating through calm warp currents when following the Astronomican's beacon, making routine adjustments to keep the Divine Mandate on course. And suddenly I couldn't do it anymore. Couldn't keep following the death screams. Couldn't keep pretending it was light rather than anguish. Couldn't keep participating in a system built on lies and exploitation and the consumption of human lives by the billions. I can't, I said aloud, though no one was listening. I can't keep doing this. My hands moved away from the throne's interface. The ship began to drift off course, the carefully maintained trajectory degrading as I stopped making corrections. Navigator Lucia, the bridge vox crackled. We're detecting course deviation. Please adjust heading. I didn't respond, couldn't respond. The weight of 13 years of knowledge I couldn't share, truths I couldn't speak. Complicity in atrocities I couldn't prevent, it was too much. I was drowning in it. Navigator Lucia, respond immediately. We require course correction. My third eye was still open, still perceiving the warp's true nature. Still seeing the Astronomican's burning souls. Still watching the Imperium's foundational lie illuminating the darkness. And I finally admitted what I'd known for 6 years but refused to acknowledge. I didn't want to serve anymore, didn't want to navigate, didn't want to be complicit in maintaining an empire built on exploitation and lies. I wanted to stop. Navigator Lucia! The Vox was screaming now. Emergency course deviation! Adjust heading immediately or we'll be pulled off route. I looked at the throne's interface. saw the controls that would correct our heading, understood that all I needed to do was resume navigation and the crisis would be averted. And I chose not to, not out of malice or intention to harm the 3,000 souls aboard, but out of simple, absolute exhaustion. I was too tired to keep navigating, too broken to keep maintaining the lie, too aware of the truth to keep serving a system that consumed people like fuel. The divine mandate continued to drift, pulled by warp currents I wasn't correcting for, heading toward turbulent regions I wasn't steering us away from. "Navigator emergency!" the Vox shrieked. "Bridge to navigation chamber! Navigator is non-responsive!" I heard boots in the corridor, security servitors coming to forcibly remove me from the throne and install the backup navigator. Standard protocol for when a navigator became non-functional during a voyage. The hatch to the navigation chamber blasted open and they rushed in. 6 combat servitors, weapons drawn, ready to extract me by force if necessary. Navigator Lucia Nostromo, the lead servitor intoned in mechanical voice. "You are relieved of navigation duties due to mental incapacitation. Submit to extraction immediately." I looked at them with my third eye still open, seeing their souls, or what remained of them. These had been people once, criminals or volunteers, or simply people in the wrong place when the Mechanicus needed raw material for servitor conversion. Now they were biological machines, their consciousness carved away and replaced with simple programming. This was what the Imperium did. Took people and made them into tools. Navigators, servitors, soldiers, workers, all of us, just resources to be exploited until we broke and then replaced. "No," I said quietly. The servitors paused, their programming uncertain how to handle refusal of direct orders. "Navigator Lucia, you are ordered to submit to extraction. Non-compliance will result in forced removal and potential harm to yourself." I said no. I repeated, my voice stronger now. "I won't navigate anymore. I won't keep following the death screams. I won't keep serving a system built on lies. Find someone else. I'm done." They extracted me by force. 6 servitors versus 1 exhausted navigator whose enhanced physical abilities were considerable but not unlimited. I fought, more out of principle than hope of victory, using my wall crawling to evade, my enhanced strength to resist, my danger sense to anticipate their movements. I lasted 3 minutes before they overwhelmed me through sheer numbers and mechanical efficiency. They sedated me, removed me from the navigation throne, and installed the backup navigator, a young woman named Katya, who I'd met briefly during house gatherings. She resumed navigation, corrected our course, and guided the divine mandate safely to Ophelia Sitzveten. I spent the rest of the voyage in the ship's brig, sedated and restrained, awaiting whatever punishment the house deemed appropriate for a navigator who'd refused to navigate. The tribunal convened 6 days after we reached Ophelia 7th. House Nostromo took refusal of service seriously. They'd sent 3 judges from Terra, senior navigators whose own careers had ended decades ago but who retained enough mental function to adjudicate house discipline. I stood before them in restraints, still sedated enough to prevent me from using my enhanced abilities to escape, while they reviewed my case file. "Navigator Lucia Meridian Nostromo," the eldest judge spoke, his voice processed through augmetics that compensated for lungs damaged by 50 years of warp exposure. "You are charged with refusal of navigation duties during active voyage, willful endangerment of Imperial vessel and crew, and mental instability that renders you unfit for continued service. How do you plead?" "Guilty," I said, because there was no point in lying. "Do you have any explanation for your actions?" I could have told them the truth, could have explained about the deep sight, the knowledge of what the Astronomicon really was, the 13 years of maintaining lies and serving a system built on exploitation. could have detailed exactly why I couldn't continue. But Hadrian's words echoed in my memory. Tell the truth and be imprisoned, or lie and survive. Except I didn't want to survive anymore. Not as a navigator, not as a tool, not as another genetic resource breeding doomed offspring to continue the cycle. I'm tired, I said simply. 13 years of service, 117 voyages. I've carved away enough of myself. I can't do it anymore. I won't do it anymore. The judges consulted amongst themselves, their remaining souls flickering with what might have been understanding or might have been contempt. It was hard to tell with being so degraded. The tribunal finds Navigator Lucia Meridian Nostromo guilty of all charges, the eldest finally announced. However, given her youth, exceptional service record, and valuable genetics, we decline to recommend execution or servitor conversion. Instead, she is sentenced to immediate and permanent retirement to the Quietus Wing, where she will remain for the duration of her natural life under medical supervision. Additionally, another judge added, her genetic material will continue to be harvested every 6 months despite her retirement status. Her bloodline is too valuable to waste simply because she's psychologically unfit for active service. Of course, even in punishment, they were still exploiting me. Do you accept this sentence? The eldest asked. Do I have a choice? I replied. No, but we ask anyway. Protocol. Then I accept, I said. Lock me in the Quietus Wing. Keep harvesting my genetics. Do whatever you need to do. I'm done fighting it. They transported me back to Terra in restraints, as if I were a dangerous criminal rather than a broken navigator who'd simply reached her limit. Hadrian visited me during the voyage, his expression carrying a mixture of sympathy and disappointment. You could have lied, he said. Could have claimed temporary psychological break, accepted treatment, returned to service. Instead, you told them you were done. That guarantees retirement. I know, I replied. I chose it. I'd rather spend the rest of my life in a cell than spend one more shift navigating through the Imperium's lies. You're 25 years old, Hadrian said. You could live another 100 years. That's a century in the Quietus Wing. Are you sure that's preferable to continuing service? Yes, I said with absolute conviction. Because continuing service means maintaining the lie, pretending the Astronomicon is holy light instead of screaming souls, pretending we're honored servants instead of exploited genetic resources, pretending any of this matters. I can't do it anymore. I won't. Hadrian was silent for a long moment. I understand, he finally said. I've been navigating for 52 years now, longer than anyone in House Nostromo except the ancient ones in the Quietus Wing. And every year it gets harder to maintain the lie, to keep serving despite knowing the truth. Someday, I'll reach the same breaking point you've reached. We all do eventually. How much longer can you last? I asked. I don't know. Maybe 5 more years, maybe 10. Until I either break completely like you did or transform into something that's no longer quite human. Either way, my career is ending. It's just a question of timing. He stood to leave, then paused. For what it's worth, Lucia, you lasted longer than most. 13 years of service while carrying deep sight is exceptional. Most navigators with that burden break within 5 years. You were stronger than you think. Strong enough to break, I said, but not strong enough to keep serving. That's a strange kind of strength. It's the only kind navigators have, Hadrian replied. The strength to keep going until we can't, and then the strength to accept the consequences of stopping. You'll have plenty of time in the Quietus Wing to decide whether you made the right choice. He left, and I was alone with my restraints and my third eye and the knowledge that my career was over at 25. The Quietus Wing looked the same as when I'd visited it 7 years ago. The same long corridors, the same transparent cells, the same collection of broken navigators whose minds had fractured beyond repair. But now I was one of them. They assigned me Cell 47, a space approximately 4 meters by 4 meters containing a bed, a waste reclamation unit, and absolutely nothing else. The walls were inscribed with protective runes thick enough to minimize warp perception to near zero. Not enough to completely blind my third eye, but enough to make the Immaterium's presence a dull background hum, rather than a constant scream. "You'll be comfortable here," the Quietus Wing's administrator informed me as they removed my restraints. His name was Collector Ven, and he'd been managing broken navigators for 40 years. Meals 3 times daily, medical supervision twice weekly, genetic harvesting every 6 months, entertainment materials available upon request. You'll find that retirement is not as terrible as active service made it seem. "Will I be allowed visitors?" I asked. "Family members may visit with approval. Other navigators are discouraged. Exposure to broken colleagues is psychologically damaging to active personnel. You'll primarily interact with staff and other residents during supervised social periods." "What about my offspring, the 37 children created from my genetics?" "They will not be informed of your location or status," Ven said. "Navigator children are not told which genetic donors are retired to prevent emotional complications. You'll remain anonymous to them." Of course. Even my children, who weren't really my children, would never know I existed. "How long will I be here?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Until death," Ven replied simply. "Average life expectancy for retired navigators is 73 years from retirement date. You're 25 now, so you can expect approximately 98 total years, with 73 of them spent here. Of course, some residents live shorter or longer depending on various factors. 73 years. Nearly 3/4 of a century in a 4-meter cell, kept alive so the house could continue harvesting my genetics. "Welcome to the Quietus Wing, Navigator Lucia," Ven said. "Try to make peace with your circumstances. It makes the time pass more easily." He left, and the cell door sealed behind him with the definitive sound of finality. I spent the first 3 days screaming. Not from pain or fear, but from the sheer weight of knowing this was my existence now. 73 years of confinement, 73 years of being genetic raw material, 73 years of slowly losing whatever remained of my mind while the house continued exploiting my bloodline. I'd thought refusing to navigate was freedom. Instead, I'd just traded one form of exploitation for another. On the 4th day, Navigator Matriarch Meridian's voice entered my mind. "Welcome, child," she said without speaking. Her cell was at the end of the corridor, but her psychic presence could reach through the protective wards when she chose to extend it. "Another navigator who couldn't bear the weight. You lasted 13 years. Respectable. Not exceptional, but respectable." "You're still here," I said aloud, unsure if she could hear conventional speech. "Where else would I be?" she replied. "I've been here for 43 years since my retirement. Another 30 or 40 years remaining, if the Chirurgeon's estimates are accurate. We don't leave the Quietus Wing, child. We die here." "How do you bear it?" I asked for the 4th time in my life. "I don't," Meridian admitted. "I exist. I persist. I watch the warp through dimensions most humans can't perceive, and I wait for my body to finally give up. That's all retirement is. Waiting for death while the house continues harvesting whatever they can extract from our genetics." "There has to be more than this," I said desperately. "There isn't," she replied. "This is what happens to navigators who refuse to keep serving. We're locked away, kept alive, and exploited until we finally die. Then our genetic material is processed one last time, and the next generation of navigators is created to repeat the cycle. That's all we are. That's all we've ever been." Her presence withdrew, leaving me alone with my thoughts. 73 years stretched before me like an eternity. I'd refused to navigate because I couldn't bear maintaining the lie anymore. Couldn't keep serving a system built on exploitation and death. Couldn't keep following the Astronomican's screaming souls. But refusal hadn't freed me. It had just changed the nature of my exploitation. I was still a resource, still being used, still breeding doomed offspring to continue the Navigator bloodlines. The only difference was that now I didn't have to look into the warp anymore. Small mercy. I sat in cell 47 in the quietest wing, at age 25 with 73 years of imprisonment ahead of me, and I finally understood the complete truth about Navigator existence. There was no escape, no freedom, no way to stop the exploitation except death. We served until we broke, or we broke and then were kept alive to continue serving in different ways. The House won either way. The Imperium won either way. And we, the Navigators, were doomed from the moment our third eye opened. I'd known this intellectually for years, but knowing it in a cell, with decades of confinement stretching ahead, made it real in a way that active service never had. I had been in the quietest wing for 17 years when Farseer Eldorath contacted me again. 42 years old chronologically, 61 subjectively, with 17 years of confinement adding their own strange temporal weight to my consciousness. The quietest wing existed in a kind of static time. Days blurred into weeks, weeks into months, months into years, until the only way I could track time's passage was by counting the genetic extraction procedures every 6 months. 34 extractions since my retirement. 34 more times the House had harvested genetic material from a broken Navigator who'd refused to serve. The irony was not lost on me. Eldorath's voice entered my mind during what passed for night in the quietest wing, when the lumens dimmed to simulate diurnal cycles for the residents who still maintained enough sanity to care about such things. Navigator Lucia, his presence felt different from Meridian's psychic touch. Where hers was human, fractured and vast but recognizably human, his was other, alien, shaped by a species whose relationship with the warp predated humanity by millions of years. "You're real," I said aloud, not particularly surprised. 17 years of confinement had dulled my capacity for surprise. "I am real," he confirmed. "I have been observing you since our first contact 13 years ago, watching your descent from active service to refusal to imprisonment. You are an interesting specimen, Navigator. Most of your kind who develop deep sight either lie about it and continue serving, or are discovered and eliminated. You chose a third path, honest refusal followed by acceptance of consequences." "I'm not sure acceptance is the right word," I replied. "I just didn't have the energy to fight anymore." "And yet you persist," Eldorath observed. 17 years of confinement and your mind remains intact, damaged certainly, degraded from 13 years of warp exposure, but intact. Most humans would have descended into complete madness after a decade in isolation." "I'm not isolated," I pointed out. "The quietest wing has other residents. We communicate sometimes. There are supervised social periods, and the staff visits regularly." "You communicate with other broken navigators who've lost most of their sanity," Eldorath corrected. "You have supervised social periods where you're watched like laboratory specimens, and the staff visits to extract genetic material or perform medical procedures. This is isolation by any meaningful definition." He wasn't wrong. "Why are you here?" I asked. "Why contact me now after 13 years of silence? What do the Aeldari want from a retired navigator locked in a cell?" "I am here," he replied, "because I made a wager with one of my peers. We disagreed about human potential. He believes your species is incapable of meaningful growth, that you're locked into cycles of exploitation and violence that will inevitably consume you. I believe differently. I believe that some humans, rare ones, can perceive truths and adapt to them rather than simply being destroyed by them. I'm not adapting, I said bitterly. I'm sitting in a cell waiting to die while the house continues harvesting my genetics. That's not growth or potential, that's just a different form of being consumed. Is it? Eldorath asked. You saw the Imperium's foundational lies and chose to stop serving them. That's not nothing. Most navigators who develop deep sight continue serving anyway because they cannot imagine alternatives. You imagined an alternative and chose it despite the cost. The alternative is a 73-year prison sentence, I pointed out. That's not exactly inspiring. No, Eldorath agreed. But it's honest. You're no longer complicit in maintaining the Imperium's lies. You're no longer navigating by following death screams and pretending they're holy light. You refused to participate and you accepted the consequences. That's more integrity than most beings, human or Eldari, ever demonstrate. I was silent for a moment, processing this. What do you want from me? I asked again. I want to offer you a choice, Eldorath said. Your imprisonment need not be eternal. The Eldari have ways of extracting individuals from Imperial custody. We could remove you from the Quietus Wing, take you somewhere beyond the Imperium's reach, give you the freedom you sought when you refused to serve. Why? I asked suspiciously. The Eldari don't do things out of kindness. What would you want in exchange? Your knowledge, he replied. You have deep sight. You perceive the warp's true nature. You understand the Imperium's infrastructure in ways few humans do. That knowledge is valuable. Not immediately. We have no need for a single navigator's information right now. But eventually that knowledge might prove useful in ways neither of us can predict. So I'd trade one form of exploitation for another, I observed. Stop being the Imperium's genetic resource and become the Eldari's information source. All relationships involve exchange, Eldorath said. But there's a difference between fair exchange and exploitation. We would offer you freedom, resources, and the opportunity to exist beyond the Imperium's control. In exchange, you would occasionally share your knowledge when we ask. That's collaboration, not exploitation. It was tempting. Emperor knows it was tempting. Escape from the Quietus Wing. Freedom from genetic harvesting, a chance to exist outside the system that had consumed my entire life. But I'd learned to be suspicious of offers that seemed too good. What's the catch? I asked. The catch, Eldorath admitted, is that leaving Imperial custody constitutes treason. If the Imperium ever recaptures you, your execution will be creative and prolonged. Additionally, living among Eldari while being human is difficult. We are not a welcoming species. And our relationship with your kind is complicated by 10,000 years of conflict. You would be safer than in the Quietus Wing, but not safe. And if I refuse? I asked. Then you remain here, he said simply. 56 more years of confinement. Genetic harvesting every 6 months, slowly losing whatever remains of your sanity until you finally die and your body is processed for one last genetic extraction. It's not an attractive option, but it's available. I thought about it, really thought about it. Escape meant freedom, but also isolation. Living among aliens who didn't particularly like humans, being useful only for my knowledge, existing in a state of permanent exile. Staying meant 56 more years in Cell 47, being exploited by the House, watching my genetics create more doomed navigators, slowly dissolving into complete madness like the other residents. How long do I have to decide? I asked. I can hold this connection open for approximately 6 more minutes, Eldorath replied. After that, maintaining psychic contact across this distance becomes prohibitively expensive. If you refuse, I will not contact you again. Rescuing unwilling humans is not worth the effort. 6 minutes to decide the rest of my life. I closed my third eye, or at least I closed it as much as possible. 17 years of retirement hadn't restored my ability to fully control it. The damage from 13 years of warp exposure was permanent. But I could reduce my perception enough to think clearly. 56 more years in the quietest wing. 56 years of genetic extractions, medical procedures, supervised social periods with other broken navigators whose minds were mostly gone. 56 years of knowing that my genetics were being used to create new navigators. I'd learned from Collector Venn that my bloodline had produced 73 offspring so far, with 17 currently in active service. 17 more doomed souls navigating through hell because my genetics were valuable. 17 more victims of the cycle I'd refused to perpetuate through my own service. But if I left, if I disappeared, the house would still have my stored genetic material. They'd continue using it for years, maybe decades. My escape wouldn't stop the exploitation of my bloodline. Unless... If I leave with you, I said to Eldorath, what happens to my stored genetic material? The samples the house has already extracted? That depends, he replied. If you wish, we could arrange for those samples to be destroyed. The Eldari have methods of infiltrating Imperial facilities when necessary. It would be expensive and dangerous, but possible. Would you? I asked. Would you actually destroy them, or is that just something you're saying to make the offer more attractive? I would arrange it, Eldorath said, and I felt truth in his psychic presence. The Eldari could lie, were exceptional liars in fact, but this felt genuine. Not out of altruism, but because it serves our interests. Anything that reduces the Imperium's navigator population is strategically beneficial. Your bloodline has produced 73 offspring over 25 years. Preventing further exploitation of your genetics eliminates a potential source of several dozen future navigators. So you'd help me for strategic reasons, I said. All decisions are strategic, Eldorath replied, but strategy that aligns with your desires is still useful to you. Would you prefer I lie and claim altruistic motives? No, I admitted. Honesty about exploitation is better than lies about serving my interests. I'd learned that lesson the hard way. Then decide, Eldorath pressed. 3 minutes remaining. Stay and be exploited by the Imperium, or leave and collaborate with the Eldari. Both options have costs, but only one offers freedom. I made my decision. I'll leave with you, I said, under 3 conditions. First, you destroy all my stored genetic material, every sample the house has ever extracted. Second, you don't lie to me about your motives or needs. I've spent my entire life being lied to by the Imperium. I won't tolerate it from the Eldari. Third, if I ever decide I want to leave your custody and take my chances in the galaxy alone, you let me go. The first condition is acceptable, Eldorath replied. The second is challenging. The Eldari relationship with truth is complex, but I will endeavor not to actively deceive you, which is more than most of my kind would offer. The third condition is acceptable with one caveat. If you leave our custody, we will ensure you cannot reveal sensitive information about Eldari operations or locations. That may require memory modification. So I can leave, but you'll erase the memories of my time with you, I said. Correct? It's the only way we can allow humans to depart voluntarily. Otherwise, the security risk is too great. It was better than I'd expected, honestly. The Imperium would simply execute anyone who tried to leave Navigator service. The Eldari were offering actual departure options, even if those options came with conditions. Then I accept, I said. Get me out of here. Destroy my genetics. and let me live whatever remains of my life beyond the Imperium's reach." "Excellent." Eldorath's presence brightened with what might have been satisfaction. "The extraction will occur in 47 hours. Be prepared. The process will be unpleasant but brief. Do not resist, do not attempt to inform anyone, and do not change your mind at the last moment. Wavering during extraction operations often results in casualties." "I won't waver," I promised. "We shall see," Eldorath replied. "Humans often discover that escaping the known even when oppressive is more terrifying than they anticipated. But I believe you have the resolve. You refuse to navigate despite the consequences. That suggests a capacity for commitment that most humans lack." His presence withdrew and I was alone again in cell 47. 47 hours until escape, 56 years of imprisonment averted, and absolutely no idea what came next. The extraction happened exactly as Eldorath promised. 47 hours after our conversation during the deepest part of the Quietus Wing's night cycle, reality simply opened. I was lying in my cell's bed, pretending to sleep while my third eye watched the warp's subtle movements through the protective wards, when the walls began to shimmer. Not physically, they remained solid stone and metal, but dimensionally. The space itself was folding, creating a tunnel that existed in geometry the Imperium's architects had never conceived. The webway. I'd seen it 13 years ago during my first deep sight experience. Now I was seeing it open directly into my cell, a passage through dimensions that bypassed the Quietus Wing's considerable security entirely. A figure emerged from the passage, tall, slender, wearing armor that looked grown rather than forged, with a helmet that concealed their features completely. Eldari. I'd never seen one in person before, but the proportions were unmistakable. Too tall, too graceful, too refined to be human. "Navigator Lucia Nostromo," the Eldari spoke in perfect High Gothic, their voice processed through the helmet's Vox systems. "You will come with me immediately. Do not speak. Do not resist. Do not look back. Any deviation from these instructions will result in extraction failure and your death." I stood from the bed wearing only the simple gray shift the Quietus Wing provided as sleepwear, and nodded. "Good," the Eldari said. "Follow." They turned and walked back into the webway passage, and I followed, stepping from Imperial custody into Eldari territory in a single step. The passage closed behind us with a sound like reality sighing, and we were in the webway proper. The webway was nothing like the warp, where the Immaterium was chaos and horror and constantly churning emotion made manifest. The webway was ordered, structured. A vast network of tunnels that existed between dimensions, shielded from the warp's influence by ancient Eldari technology that predated human civilization by millions of years. It was beautiful, in an alien way. The walls weren't solid, they were fields of energy that created the impression of solidity while actually being permeable to specific frequencies. Light moved through the tunnels in patterns that suggested intentional design rather than natural phenomenon. And the sense of space was wrong. I could perceive distances that shouldn't fit inside the geometric volume the tunnels appeared to occupy. "Do not attempt to understand the webway's structure with your navigator sight," the Eldari warned as we walked. "Human minds are not designed to process this architecture. Prolonged exposure to webway geometry often causes psychological damage in your kind." "I've spent 13 years staring into the warp," I replied, speaking despite being told not to. "I think my mind is already damaged." "The warp is chaos," the Eldari said. "Chaos the human mind can process, even if that processing is damaging. The webway is order that your species lacks the cognitive framework to comprehend. It's a different kind of damage, more subtle, more permanent. Close your third eye or risk permanent cognitive restructuring." I closed my third eye, or tried to. 17 years of deteriorated control meant it didn't close completely, but I managed to reduce my perception to minimal levels. We walked for what felt like hours, but was probably much less. Time didn't work properly in the webway, and my internal chronometer had never recovered from years of warp exposure anyway. Eventually, we emerged into a space that looked like a way station. A large chamber where multiple webway tunnels converged, populated by a dozen other Eldari moving with purpose that suggested military operations. "Wait here," my escort commanded, gesturing to a space along the wall. "Farseer Eldorath will arrive within the hour to finalize your extraction and begin your orientation." They left, and I was alone among the Eldari for the first time in my life. They ignored me completely, not out of rudeness, or at least not only rudeness, but because I was beneath their notice. To them, I was probably just another human asset, a resource being moved from one location to another, no more worthy of attention than cargo being transported through their webway. I watched them work using my normal vision since my third eye was mostly closed. They moved with efficiency that made Imperial operations look crude by comparison. No wasted motion, no unnecessary communication. Just perfectly coordinated action suggesting either telepathy or centuries of working together. They were beautiful, in a way that was almost offensive. Where humans in the Imperium were ground down by labor and pollution and constant war, the Eldari looked like they'd been sculpted by artists. Perfect proportions, graceful movement. The kind of physical refinement that suggested genetic engineering or simply millions of years of evolution that humanity hadn't experienced. I hated them a little for it, for being so perfect while humanity ground itself to dust just trying to survive. "That hatred is natural," Farseer Eldorath's voice came from behind me. I turned to find him standing there, no longer a psychic presence, but a physical being. He wore robes that seemed to shift colors depending on viewing angle, and his face was ancient. Not aged in the human sense, but carrying the weight of centuries visible in expressions that suggested he'd seen empires rise and fall and barely cared. "I'm not sure I'd call it hatred," I replied. "More like bitter recognition of how unfair the galaxy is. You get to be perfect and ancient and living in structures that transcend dimensions. We get 40 years of grinding labor before we collapse from exhaustion." "We had an empire once," Eldorath said quietly. "Millions of worlds. Technology that made current human achievement look like children playing with rocks. We were gods, Navigator. And our hubris birthed a chaos god that consumed 90% of our species and shattered our empire completely. You think your Imperium is doomed? We've already experienced our doom. Everything you see, the webway, our craft worlds, and our desperate survival is just the aftermath of apocalypse. So yes, we're beautiful, but we're also extinct. We just haven't finished dying yet." He gestured for me to follow, leading me deeper into the way station. "Welcome to your new existence, Navigator Lucia Nostromo. You've traded one form of doom for another. The only question is whether you'll find this doom more bearable than the Imperium's version." I lived among the Eldari for 27 years before I finally understood what doom actually meant. 69 years old chronologically, though subjective time had become so distorted by warp exposure, webway travel, and Eldari temporal manipulation that I'd stopped counting. My body was aging, but slowly. The Eldari had provided medical care that extended human lifespan, not out of kindness, but because maintaining their assets was logical. I was still an asset, just a different kind. Eldorath had kept his promises. My stored genetic material was destroyed. I'd watched through a scrying device as Eldari infiltrators broke into House Nostromo's genetic vaults and systematically eliminated every sample they'd extracted over 25 years. 73 potential offspring prevented. 17 already existing children whose bloodline ended with them because there would be no more. The house had declared me deceased shortly after my disappearance. Killed during an insurgent attack on the quietest wing, they claimed, body destroyed beyond recovery. A lie, but a useful one. Dead navigators were easier to process than missing ones, and I'd learned what the Eldari actually wanted from me. Not military intelligence, as I'd suspected. Not navigator techniques or warp navigation secrets. Those they already understood better than any human ever could. What they wanted was anthropological data. "You are a window into human psychology," Eldorath explained during one of our many conversations over the years. A navigator who developed deep sight, saw the Imperium's foundational lies and chose refusal over complicity. That's exceptionally rare. Most humans who perceive such truths either deny them, rationalize them, or break completely. You did none of those things. You simply refused to participate. "I broke," I pointed out. "I spent 17 years in the quietest wing losing my mind." "But you never rationalized your imprisonment as deserved," Eldorath corrected. "You never accepted the Imperium's logic that exploitation was necessary. You maintained your perception of injustice despite suffering consequences for that perception. That's unusual among humans. Your species typically adapts to oppression by accepting it as natural. You didn't." "So I'm a psychological curiosity," I said. "A human who couldn't adjust properly to being exploited." "You're evidence that human psychology is more flexible than my colleagues believe," Eldorath replied. "Which supports my argument that humanity might survive its current trajectory rather than inevitably self-destructing. That has strategic implications for how we interact with your species. You're studying me to decide if humanity is worth preserving," I realized. "We're studying you to decide if humanity is capable of growth," he corrected. "Preservation is not our concern. We barely preserve ourselves, but understanding whether humans can adapt to truth rather than being destroyed by it informs our long-term strategies. Over 27 years, I learned what the Eldari actually were. A dying species desperately managing their own extinction. They spoke of their empire's fall with the detachment of people discussing ancient history, but the trauma was visible to anyone who looked closely. They'd birthed a chaos god through their own excess and hubris. 90% of their species had been consumed in the birthing scream. The survivors fled to craft worlds, massive vessels housing the remnants of their civilization, or became outcasts, pirates, or worse. Every Eldari I met was haunted by the same knowledge that haunted navigators. They were doomed. Their species had no future beyond managed decline. Birth rates were catastrophically low. Every death diminished them in ways they couldn't recover from. And when they died, their souls were consumed by the chaos god they'd created, unless they took extreme measures to prevent it. They were extinct. They just hadn't finished dying yet, just like navigators, just like the Imperium, just like everything in this galaxy that still pretended to be alive. "We are all doomed," I said to Eldorath during our final conversation before I chose to leave. "Navigators, Eldari, the Imperium, humanity itself. The only variable is timeline and how much we suffer before the end." "Yes," he agreed simply. "That's the fundamental truth this galaxy teaches. Doom is inevitable. Suffering is mandatory. The only choice is how we face both." "And how do you face it?" I asked. "You, personally. Not the Eldari as a species, but you, a farseer who's lived for, how long?" 4,317 years, he replied. "And I face doom the same way you did when you refused to navigate. By choosing authenticity over complicity. The Eldari could survive longer if we compromised certain principles. We could breed more aggressively, sacrificing quality for quantity. We could abandon our craft worlds and scatter as pirates, extending individual lifespans at the cost of cultural death. We could even surrender to chaos and become something monstrous but immortal. But you don't, I observed. But we don't, he confirmed, because becoming monsters to survive makes survival meaningless. Better to die as ourselves than live as something we despise. You understand this. You chose imprisonment over continuing to serve the Imperium's lies. You valued authenticity over comfort. I'm not sure that was wisdom, I admitted. It just felt impossible to keep lying. That's what authenticity is, Eldorath said. The point where lying to yourself becomes more painful than accepting truth regardless of consequences. Most beings never reach that point. You did. That's why you're valuable. Not as an asset, but as evidence that humans can choose truth over comfort. I left the Eldari 27 years after arriving. Not because I was mistreated. They'd been fair by their standards, providing care and resources in exchange for my cooperation. Not because I'd learned everything I wanted to know. The Eldari kept secrets that would take lifetimes to uncover. But because I'd finally understood what freedom actually meant, and it wasn't living among aliens who studied me like a specimen. I want to leave, I told Eldorath, per our original agreement, with memory modification if necessary to protect your secrets. Where will you go? He asked. You're 69 years old. The Imperium believes you're dead. Your house has moved on. Your genetic offspring don't know you exist. You have no resources, no connections, no place in human society. I'll figure it out, I replied. I survived 17 years in the quietest wing. I survived 27 years among the Eldari. I can survive whatever comes next. Eldorath studied me with eyes that had seen empires rise and fall. You're not looking for comfort, he observed. You're looking for meaning. You think that existing without being exploited by the Imperium or by us will provide that meaning. Maybe, I admitted. Or maybe I'll discover that freedom without purpose is just another form of doom, but at least it'll be my doom, not the Imperium's, not yours, mine. Very well, Eldorath said. We'll arrange transport to a human settlement beyond Imperial control. One of the border regions where refugees and deserters congregate. You'll receive memory modification to erase sensitive information about our operations, but your core memories and identity will remain intact, and you'll receive sufficient resources to survive for approximately 1 year before you need to find your own way. Thank you, I said and meant it. Don't thank me, he replied. This was always the arrangement. You held up your end, 27 years of cooperation, anthropological data that supported my research. Now I'm holding up mine. It's exchange, not generosity. Honest exploitation is still better than lies about serving my interests, I observed, echoing words from our first conversation. Yes, Eldorath agreed. That lesson alone might justify the resources invested in your rescue. Most humans never learn it. They deposited me on a half-feral human colony in the Eastern Fringe, beyond the Imperium's effective control. The settlement was built from salvaged ships and desperation, populated by deserters, refugees, and people who'd simply decided that dying on the margins was preferable to living under Imperial rule. I was 69 years old with no genetic offspring who knew me. No house to return to, no Navigator career, and approximately 1 year's worth of resources. I was also, for the first time in my life, actually free. No one demanded my service. No one harvested my genetics. No one forced me to navigate through hell while pretending it was holy work. I could simply exist. Live, make choices based on what I wanted rather than what the Imperium or the Navigator houses or even the Eldari needed from me. It was terrifying. It was glorious. It was probably going to kill me within a few years because I was old and damaged and had no survival skills beyond navigating through the warp. But it was mine. I'm 73 years old now. Subjective time has become so distorted I'm not actually certain. And I'm writing this in the margins of a star chart I'm selling to smugglers who need routes through the eastern fringe. Turns out, even without serving the Imperium, Navigator knowledge is valuable. Pirates, smugglers, and independent traders all need guidance through the warp, and a retired navigator who can provide advice without reporting to Imperial authorities is worth something. I charge fair prices. I don't take jobs that involve obvious atrocities, and I don't navigate, never again. But I can teach others to read warp currents well enough to survive short jumps. It's not much, but it's honest work that doesn't require exploitation or lies. I have maybe 10 more years before my body gives up. The Eldari medical care extended my lifespan, but it didn't make me immortal. Eventually, the decades of warp exposure will finish degrading my cellular structure, and I'll simply stop. And that's fine, because I'll have lived those last years as myself, not as the Imperium's genetic resource, not as the Eldari's research subject, not as anyone's tool, just as Lucia, a human who refused to accept that exploitation was inevitable. The Imperium will continue grinding people into ammunition. The Navigator houses will continue breeding doomed offspring. The galaxy will continue its slow collapse into heat death or chaos consumption. But I won't be complicit anymore. And for a navigator, for someone bred and trained and genetically designed to serve the Imperium's needs regardless of cost, that's as close to victory as possible.